Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something that sounds relaxing, and is in fact the opposite of relaxing, summer. Specifically summer in Victorian London, if you happen to be born a woman and also born poor, which statistically you were. Forget parasols and lemonade on the lawn, that's rich people summer. We're talking about the other summer, the one with no plumbing, no ice, 4 layers of wool, and a river that smells like it personally wronged God. So before you get comfortable, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No pressure, I'm not your Victorian husband. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always somehow 2 AM somewhere, and I respect that about all of you. Now dim the lights, put on a fan, and get yourself good and comfortable, because we are about to make you very grateful for that fan. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to sweat through a heatwave in a corset? Have you ever wondered how women washed anything, cooked anything, or survived childbirth in a city with no air conditioning and a sewage system, best described as aspirational? Did Victorian women get to complain about the heat, or was even sweating considered unladylike? Could you last one single July afternoon boiling laundry over an open fire in full sleeves, in a room with the windows painted shut? Would you survive a summer where the water might kill you faster than the heat does? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in the summer of 1858 in a cramped little room above a London street that hasn't seen fresh air since the reign of the previous king. You're a woman. You're poor. And you're about to find out that hot girl summer meant something extremely different 170 years ago. Good luck. The first thing you notice before you've even opened your eyes is that you're already damp. Not dew on the grass damp like a boiled ham. Your room is a single low-ceilinged space tucked under the roof, which means you've spent the whole night sleeping directly beneath a giant slate frying pan that the sun has been personally heating since 5 in the morning. You blink awake to find your nightdress glued to your back and your hair plastered to your neck in a way that no amount of pinning will fix later. There's no ceiling fan. There's no fan of any kind that doesn't require someone's actual arm. There's just you, the mattress, and a room that has been quietly cooking overnight like a very patient, very slow oven. The roof above you is slate, which soaks up sun all day and then generously releases it all night directly into your skull. Your window, if you're lucky enough to have one, is small, set high, and painted shut by a landlord who considered ventilation a luxury reserved for tenants who pay more. Even if you could force it open, the air outside isn't exactly a reward. It's thick with coal smoke, horse dung, and whatever the tannery 3 streets over is doing this week, so you leave it shut and simply marinate. You share this room with at least one other body, possibly several, all of whom are generating their own personal heat like a row of little furnaces that also snore. Someone's elbow's in your ribs, someone's foot has found its way near your face. Nobody moved much in the night because moving required effort, and effort generates heat, and heat is the enemy now. You all just lay there, silently competing for the 2 square inches of mattress that weren't currently being used as a personal sauna. Think about your own mornings for a second. Think about how unbearable it feels when the air conditioning breaks for one night and you toss and turn, furious, checking the thermostat every 40 minutes like it might apologise. Now take away the thermostat, take away the box fan, take away the very concept of a cold glass of water from the fridge. What you have left is a Victorian July, and it does not negotiate. You sit up, and the mattress makes a sound like it's relieved to be rid of you. It's stuffed with straw or flock or whatever cheap fibrous material was cheapest that year, and after a night of trapping your body heat, it smells faintly of hay that has given up on itself. You press a hand to your own forehead and find it slick, though you haven't done a single thing yet except exist in a room that refuses to cool down. Outside your little window, the street below is already stirring. Handcarts creak. A dog barks at nothing in particular. Somewhere, a baby is crying in that specific overheated way that suggests nobody in that household got any real sleep either. You are, it turns out, not alone in your suffering. This is a citywide condition. An entire population of working women waking up simultaneously, damp, cross, and already tired before the day has technically started. There is, of course, no ice water waiting for you. No condensation-covered glass. No crisp cold splash to the face. There's a jug, and whatever's in it is room temperature at best, lukewarm at worst, having sat out all night absorbing the same heat as everything else in the room. You drink it anyway because thirst doesn't care about optimal serving temperature, and you've learned not to be picky about small comforts you don't actually have access to. You glance toward the corner where your clothes are folded, heavy wool and cotton layers waiting patiently to make everything worse, and you allow yourself exactly one long, weary breath before you have to start moving. Because whatever this room lacks in airflow, it makes up for in schedule. There's water to fetch, a fire to light despite the fact that lighting a fire in this heat feels like a war crime, and a full day of labour ahead that will not pause to acknowledge that you are, medically speaking, already overheated before 8 in the morning. You swing your legs off the mattress, plant your bare feet on warm floorboards that have also apparently been cooking since dawn, and accept the plain, unglamorous truth of it. There is no version of today that involves being cool. There is only a sliding scale of how hot, and right now, freshly woken and already sweating through last night's nightdress, you are somewhere near the bottom of that scale with the entire day still ahead of you to climb. Somewhere in a house across town, a lady of the means is waking up in a room with high ceilings, tall windows thrown open to a garden, and a maid ready to bring her something cool. You do not know this lady. You will never meet this lady. But rest assured, whatever she's dealing with this morning, it is not a straw mattress that has spent all night impersonating a bread oven. You, meanwhile, get to greet the day exactly as you left it. Warm, weary, and completely out of ideas for how to fix either. The walls themselves seem to be sweating alongside you. A faint dampness clinging to the plaster, where the heat has condensed against the one patch of stone that never quite dries out. You've stopped noticing the smell of it most mornings, the way you stop noticing most smells that never actually leave. But today, freshly woken and already overheated, it registers again, sharp and mildewed, a small, unpleasant welcome to the day. Somewhere below, a rooster that has no business living in this part of the city announces the morning with total, oblivious confidence, as if anyone here needed reminding that it had, in fact, arrived. You listen for a moment to the sounds gathering in the building around you, the creak of another family's floorboards overhead, a cough through the thin wall to your left, someone's baby beginning to fuss 2 doors down in that specific pre-dawn way that tells you its mother is already awake and already exhausted. There's a strange comfort in it, oddly, the knowledge that you are one small, overheated body among many, that this particular misery is being experienced in stereo by half the street at exactly the same moment. Misery shared this thoroughly starts to feel less like misfortune, and more like simply the local weather. You think, briefly and without much hope, of the mornings you've heard described from grander households, cool linen sheets changed weekly, a basin of fresh water brought up before you've even opened your eyes, windows that actually open onto air that hasn't been breathed by 6 other people first. You let the thought pass through you, the way you let most such thoughts pass through you these days, not quite bitterness, or a kind of distant, weary curiosity about a life running parallel to yours that you will never actually touch. Then you refocus on the one task in front of you, because the one task in front of you is the only one that matters this early in the morning. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion, there is still, most mornings, a small flicker of something like resolve, the stubborn animal instinct that gets a body up and moving regardless of how thoroughly the previous night failed to restore it. You've never quite examined where that resolve comes from, whether it's habit, necessity, or something closer to pride, but you're grateful for it all the same, because without it, this particular morning, like every other morning this summer, would be considerably harder to face. The church bell sounds again somewhere in the distance, marking the half hour, and you use it as your own private signal, the same way you use it every morning, a small external prompt that pushes you the rest of the way out of bed when your own will alone isn't quite sufficient. You've come to know that bell almost as well as you know your own name, its particular timbre distinct from the other church bells scattered across the parish, a small auditory landmark in a day otherwise defined by sameness. There's comfort, oddly, in that sameness, in knowing exactly what shape the day will take before it's even properly begun. You know which chores come first, which corner of the room warms fastest, which floorboard creaks loudest underfoot. A whole private catalogue of small predictable facts that let you move through the motions without having to think too hard about any single one of them. In a summer, this relentless predictability has become its own strange comfort, proof that even when the weather refuses to cooperate, your own routines still hold steady. You've noticed, too, that this same predictability makes the unexpected moments stand out all the more sharply when they do arrive. A neighbour's unusual kindness, an especially vivid sunrise glimpsed through the gap in your painted shut window, a rare morning when the air feels marginally less punishing than the day before. These small departures from the routine register almost like events now, noteworthy simply for interrupting a pattern that otherwise repeats itself with such stubborn, unyielding consistency. You peel yourself off the mattress and face the day's first cruel joke, getting dressed. Not in something breezy, not in anything resembling common sense. You're putting on a chemise, stays, a petticoat or two, and a heavy wool or cotton dress buttoned to the throat, because respectability does not take the summer off. Let's walk through the wardrobe, shall we? Because it is, frankly, a war crime disguised as fashion. First comes the chemise, a thin linen or cotton layer that sits against your skin, and is, in theory, the breathable part of the outfit. It is the only breathable part of the outfit. Everything after this point is a steady march away from breathing. Next, the stays. Not quite the steel-bone torture devices of the previous century, but still a snug, structured undergarment that laces you into a shape society has decided is appropriate, regardless of what the actual temperature is doing. You pull the laces tight because loose stays are considered slovenly, and slovenly is not a look you can afford when your neighbours are already watching for any excuse to gossip. So you cinch yourself into a garment that restricts your ribs' ability to expand fully, on the one day of the year your lungs would really appreciate the extra room. Then the petticoats, possibly 2, possibly 3, if you're headed somewhere that expects a fuller skirt shape. Each one is another layer of fabric between your skin and the open air, another small blanket you're wearing directly against your body, while the temperature climbs toward what you would, in another century, call a public health emergency. Finally, the dress itself, buttoned or hooked from waist to throat, sleeves long, because a lady's arms, or a woman with any pretensions to respectability, do not appear bare in public. Never mind that it's 85 degrees and climbing. Never mind that the fabric is a heavy cotton print, or worse, wool, because wool doesn't care what season it is. Wool is a year-round commitment. You fasten the last button at your collar and already feel your pulse in your ears. Try, for a moment, to imagine wearing 4 long-sleeved layers to go stand over a hot stove, then walk half a mile, then do physical labour for 10 hours, all without once being allowed to loosen so much as a cuff. Now imagine doing it, while also being told that any visible perspiration is a moral failing. It's less getting dressed and more constructing a personal greenhouse and then being blamed for the humidity. You do have options, technically. Lighter cottons exist, printed muslins and cheap calicos that are marginally cooler than wool, and if you're fortunate, that's what fills your 1 or 2 work dresses. But marginally cooler than wool is a bit like saying a lukewarm bath is marginally cooler than a boiling one. It's true, and it doesn't actually help very much. There's also the question of colour. Dark colours show dirt less, which matters enormously when you can't exactly run a hot iron over your dress every evening, or send it out for cleaning. So plenty of working women are dressed in browns, deep blues and blacks, fabrics that soak up every ray of sun like they've made a personal pact with it. You are essentially dressed as a solar panel with sleeves, except instead of generating electricity you generate sweat, and you cannot simply take any of it off. Not the stays, not the petticoat, not the sleeves. To be seen in public in your chemise, or even without your outer layer properly buttoned, is to invite exactly the kind of attention no working woman wants. The kind that costs you your reputation, your position, sometimes your livelihood. So you suffer in silence, and in wool, and you do it every single day of the heatwave, because the alternative is social ruin, and social ruin doesn't pay the rent. By the time you've finished dressing, you've already broken a sweat doing nothing more strenuous than fastening buttons. Your collar sits damp against your throat before you've so much as stepped outside. You catch your reflection in whatever cracked bit of glass or polished tin passes for a mirror, and you look, correctly, like a woman who is about to have a very long day. You take one last breath as deep as the stays will allow, which isn't very deep at all, and you head for the door. Somewhere out there, the sun is already high, the pavement is already radiating heat back up at you like a personal insult, and you are dressed, head to toe, for a Victorian winter, because that is simply how this works. Fashion, it turns out, does not care about your comfort. It never really did. Your feet go into boots that were never quite broken in properly and never quite fit right either. Leather stiff from yesterday's heat, and still faintly damp with yesterday's sweat. Because there was no time and no sun-warmed windowsill available to dry them out fully overnight, you lace them tight anyway, because loose boots on cobblestones are an invitation to a twisted ankle, and a twisted ankle in this economy is functionally a small disaster. Your stockings, wool, naturally, because cotton ones wore through weeks ago and there's been no spare coin for new ones, cling immediately to your calves in a way that promises a long, itchy day ahead. You catch a glimpse of the other women on your street through the doorway, all of them dressed in some close variation of what you're wearing. Dark fabric, high collars, sleeves that end at the wrist rather than anywhere sensible. A kind of unspoken uniform that nobody chose and everybody wears anyway. There's a strange solidarity in it, watching an entire street of women march out into the heat in matching discomfort, like an army that never signed up and never gets discharged, only reassigned to tomorrow's version of the exact same battle. You allow yourself just for a moment to imagine what it might feel like to walk out that door in something lighter, something sleeveless, something that didn't treat your own skin like a scandal waiting to happen. The thought doesn't last long. There's simply no version of today, or any day this summer, where that particular freedom is available to you, and dwelling on it too long only makes the 4 layers you're actually wearing feel heavier than they already do. You've noticed too that the discomfort has a way of fading into the background once the day's actual tasks take hold, the way any constant, unchanging pain eventually stops announcing itself quite so loudly. It never disappears entirely, not really, but by mid-morning you've mostly stopped consciously registering the sensation of wool against damp skin, filing it away with the dozen other low-grade miseries you've simply learned to carry without comment. You check your reflection one last time before stepping out, not from vanity but from habit, a final confirmation that you look, at least outwardly, presentable enough for whatever the street decides to demand of you today. Whatever the mirror shows you, presentable or not, there's rarely time to do much about it beyond a quick smoothing of hair or straightening of collar, and you've long since made peace with settling for whatever version of yourself the morning allows. There was a time, you vaguely recall, when appearance mattered to you in a different way. A girlish pride in ribbons and a well-set curl that this life has long since worn down into something far more practical. You don't mourn it exactly, that earlier version of yourself. She simply belongs to a different chapter, one with fewer buckets and considerably more sleep, and you've made your peace with the trade, mostly, on all but the very worst mornings. Before you can do anything else, you need water, and water does not come to you. You take your bucket and join the queue at the shared pump, which by mid-morning already has a line of women who all look like they'd like to fight somebody. Possibly the pump. There is no tap in your room. There is no tap in your building. Water lives outside at a communal pump shared by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of households on your street. And getting it is not a quick errand. It's a small daily expedition with its own social order, its own etiquette, and its own simmering resentments. You grab your bucket, which is heavier empty than you'd like, and about to become much heavier full, and you head out into a morning that's already warm enough to feel like an afterthought of last night's heat rather than a fresh start. The street is dust and packed dirt, and today it's the kind of dry that kicks up with every step, coating your hem in a fine grey film before you've even reached the corner. At the pump, there's already a line. Of course there's already a line. Everyone on your street needs water for the same reasons you do. Cooking, washing, drinking, and everyone's schedule seems to converge at exactly this hour. You take your place behind a woman you vaguely recognise from 2 doors down, and in front of a girl who can't be more than 10, already hauling a bucket nearly as big as she is. The wait gives you time to appreciate, in a grim sort of way, just how hot metal gets in direct sun. The pump handle, when you finally reach it, is warm enough that gripping it feels less like drawing water and more like handling something recently removed from an oven. You pump anyway, arm aching, and watch the water splash into your bucket, and you allow yourself a small, uncharitable hope that it's at least clean today, because clean is more of a suggestion than a guarantee. Once it's full, you don't get to simply carry it. You hoist it, hip cocked to balance the weight, and begin the walk home, water sloshing against your skirt with every step, adding a damp patch to a dress that's already fighting a losing battle against the heat. A full bucket of water is heavy in any weather. In a heat wave, carrying it home while wearing 4 layers of fabric turns a simple chore into something closer to an endurance event, and there's no medal at the end, just more chores. Think about how automatic water is for you. You turn a handle and it appears, cold if you want it cold, and you've never once had to consider the structural engineering required to get it there. Now imagine that every single glass of water, every pot for cooking, every basin for washing, requires this exact walk, this exact queue, this exact heavy carry, multiple times a day, in 90-degree heat, in a wool dress. Your daily step count would be extraordinary. Your patients would not survive the week, and you'll be back. This trip gets you through breakfast and maybe the first wash of the morning, but by afternoon you'll need more for cooking, for cleaning, for the endless small tasks that all, somehow, require water you don't have easy access to. So this walk isn't a one-time inconvenience, it's a recurring tax on your day, paid in sweat and shoulder strain several times before the sun goes down. By the time you get the bucket home and set it down, careful not to slosh half of it onto the floor, your arms are trembling slightly and your dress is soaked through at the hip where the bucket rested against you the whole way. You haven't cooked anything yet. You haven't washed anything yet. You've simply acquired the raw material required to begin the actual work of the day, and it's already cost you a solid 20 minutes of queuing and hauling under a sun that shows no signs of mercy. Somewhere, someone with money is turning on a tap, or better yet, ringing a bell for a servant to bring water instead. You allow yourself exactly one bitter thought about that, because dwelling on it won't fill your bucket any faster, and there's a fire to light and a whole day of work still waiting, patient and unbothered, for you to catch your breath and get back to it. The pump itself has its own small society built up around it, a rotating cast of regulars who know each other's names, each other's troubles, each other's children by sight if not always by name. This morning it's the usual crowd, plus one new face, a young woman recently arrived from the countryside, still visibly startled by how much of her day is apparently going to revolve around this one iron spout. You catch her eye and offer a small knowing nod, the silent greeting of women who understand exactly what the next few months of her life are about to look like. Someone further back in the line grumbles about the water pressure, which has been weaker than usual all week, a fact everyone attributes to some combination of the heat, the low water table, and general municipal indifference, though nobody has any actual authority to confirm or deny any of it. You've learned not to expect explanations for why things are worse than usual. Things being worse than usual is simply the default condition of most infrastructure you rely on, and asking why rarely produces anything but a shrug and a wasted breath better spent elsewhere. By the time you've made your second trip of the morning, the line has grown longer still, women arriving in a steady trickle that seems to match the sun's steady climb, each of them carrying the exact same expression you're fairly sure is currently on your own face, a kind of resigned, sweaty determination that has long since stopped bothering to look surprised by any of it. You count, without really meaning to, exactly how many more trips today is likely to demand of you, a quiet, running tally that follows you through most of the morning. It rarely comes to fewer than 4 or 5 separate journeys by the time evening arrives, each one costing the same queue, the same wait, the same walk home, and you've simply accepted that particular arithmetic as one of the fixed, unchangeable costs of simply being alive and thirsty in this city. A stray cat has taken to loitering near the pump most mornings, hopeful for spilled droplets, and you've grown fond of it in a distant sort of way, one more small, familiar fixture in a routine that otherwise offers very little to look forward to. You spare it a scrap of whatever you happen to have, a crust, a bit of rind, small enough not to matter to you but apparently significant enough to earn you the cat's brief, airy loyalty each morning. It's a small, silly ritual, feeding a half-wild cat that owes you nothing and would abandon you instantly for a better offer. But there's something quietly satisfying in it all the same, a tiny act of generosity you can actually afford to make in a life where generosity of any kind is otherwise in desperately short supply. Monday is wash day no matter the weather, and today the weather has decided to personally punish you for it. You haul the copper pot over the fire and start boiling linens in a room that is now, conservatively, hotter than the sun. Wash day does not consult the calendar for temperature. It arrives on schedule week after week, and today's schedule happens to coincide with a heatwave that has already left the whole street limp and irritable by 9 in the morning. But sheets don't wash themselves and shirts don't come clean through sheer force of hoping, so you set to building up the fire, which is in itself an act of quiet self-sabotage in this weather. You feed coal or wood into the grate beneath the copper, and the fire catches, and within minutes your small room has transformed from merely hot to something approaching a kiln. The copper itself, a big metal basin set over the flame, needs its water brought to a full rolling boil before you can even begin, and there's no shortcut for that. You wait sweating, feeding the fire, while a room that was already unbearable adds live flame to the equation. Once the water's boiling, in go the linens, poked and stirred with a wooden dolly or a long stick, agitated over and over to work the dirt loose. Steam rises off the copper in thick white clouds, adding humidity to heat in a combination that would be, in any other context, classified as a spa treatment. Here, it is simply Monday. You lean over the pot to check the wash, and a wall of steam hits you square in the face, fogging your vision and leaving your skin instantly slick. Your arms, bare to the elbow for this one task at least, are pink from the heat radiating off both fire and water. Sweat runs freely down your back, soaking into layers of clothing that were already struggling before you lit a single flame. Consider for a second standing directly over a pot of boiling water on the hottest day of the year, on purpose, for hours, because the alternative is wearing dirty linens for another week. There's no spin cycle here, no delicate setting, no walking away and coming back to a machine that's done the work for you. Every single garment gets individually boiled, stirred, lifted out dripping and impossibly heavy with water, and wrung by hand, your forearms straining against the twist, water running down your wrists and pooling at your feet. After the boil comes the rinse, which requires more water, hauled from that same pump you visited earlier, because apparently one trip was never going to be enough today. And after the rinse comes the wringing, garment by garment, twisted tight between your hands until your knuckles ache and the fabric finally surrenders most of its water, though never quite all of it. Then it's hung, if you're lucky enough to have anywhere to hang it, strung across the room or out a window on a line, dripping onto the floor below, adding yet more humidity to a space that has, by this point, essentially become a greenhouse. The room doesn't cool down when you're finished. If anything, it holds the heat even longer, steam-soaked walls and a lingering fire that takes hours to fully die. You step outside just to breathe air that isn't actively boiling, and even the dusty summer street feels like relief by comparison, which tells you everything you need to know about how bad it was inside. And this isn't a once-a-month event. This is weekly, sometimes more if you're doing laundry for a family or taking in extra washing to make ends meet, which plenty of women do, turning their own, already miserable wash day into paid work for someone else's linens too. More boiling, more steam, more hauling, all for a few extra coins that will, with any luck, cover the difference between getting by and not. By the time the last shirt is wrung and hung, you're soaked through yourself. Your hands are red and pruned, and your back aches from bending over the copper for the better part of the morning. There is admittedly a certain satisfaction in a line of clean linens, pale and orderly, drying in whatever breeze exists. But you earned that satisfaction the hard way, boiled and wrung right alongside the wash, in a room that, for a few hours today, was arguably the hottest place in London. The smell lingers long after the fire's been let die down, a strange mix of hot metal, wet wool, and the particular sharp scent of the soap you use, harsh and industrial, nothing like the soft-scented bars you've heard finer households favour. Your hands, still faintly wrinkled from hours in hot water, smell of it too, a smell you've come to associate so strongly with Mondays that you suspect you'll still catch a phantom whiff of it on quiet Monday mornings even decades from now, long after this particular summer is nothing but a story you tell. You survey the room once the last garment is hung, steam still rising faintly from the copper as it cools, and take a rare moment to simply stand still in the doorway, letting whatever breeze exists outside brush against your damp collar. It's not relief exactly, not with the day barely a third finished, but it's something adjacent to relief, a brief acknowledgement that one enormous task has been wrestled to the ground before the next one climbs on top of you. Down the street you can hear the telltale sounds of other households mid-wash, the rhythmic slap of wet fabric against a washboard, a woman calling out to a child to fetch more water, the general percussion of a whole neighbourhood engaged in the identical battle you've just fought. It's oddly companionable, this shared soundscape of Monday suffering, proof that whatever else divides the women on this street, laundry day unites them completely, whether they like it or not. By early afternoon, the linens have mostly dried where you've hung them, stiffened slightly in the heat rather than softened, a texture you've grown used to and no longer really notice until you fold something fresh from outside against something older, and remember, briefly, what proper softness used to feel like before this particular summer began wearing everything down, fabric included. You fold each piece carefully anyway, out of habit as much as pride, stacking them neatly despite knowing full well they'll be sweated through and rumpled again within a day or two of actual wear. There's a quiet dignity in the folding itself, a small insistence that things be done properly even when the results won't last, a habit passed down from your own mother that you find yourself unable and honestly unwilling to abandon. Some habits, you've decided, are worth keeping precisely because they cost so little and preserve so much. A small, stubborn thread of order stitched through a season that otherwise seems intent on unravelling everything it touches. Dinner does not cook itself, and the only way to cook it is to light a coal range that turns your kitchen into a furnace, in a house where the windows either don't open or open directly onto someone else's coal range. By midday, after the water and the washing, you'd like nothing more than to sit somewhere still and cool and not move for a solid hour. Instead, there's dinner to think about, and dinner means fire, because there is no other way to cook anything. No electric hob quietly humming away, no microwave, nothing that generates heat only exactly where you need it. Just an iron range that once lit heats the entire room around it with total indifference to the season. You crouch to lay the coal, strike a light and coax the flame up, and within minutes the range is doing its job admirably, which is to say, it's radiating heat in every direction, including directly at you, since you have to stand close enough to actually use it. The kitchen, if you can call your small cooking corner a kitchen, climbs in temperature fast, the air thickening with coal smoke and the particular smell of hot iron. If you're in a tenement, your kitchen shares a wall, sometimes a chimney flue, with your neighbour's kitchen, and they're cooking too because everyone eats dinner around the same time, which means the heat from your fire is joined by the heat radiating through the wall from theirs. It's less like cooking in a room and more like cooking inside a communal oven that the whole building has agreed to preheat together. You'd love to open a window and let some of this escape, but windows, where they exist, often don't open more than a crack, swollen shut by damp winters and never properly maintained, or they open directly onto an air shaft or alley that's just as hot and considerably worse smelling. So you cook with what air you have, which is increasingly less air and increasingly more smoke, steam and radiant heat, all trapped in a small space with nowhere to go except into you. Picture standing directly in front of your oven, door open, for the better part of an hour, in a room where the air conditioning has been switched off and the windows are painted shut. Now do it while stirring a pot, checking bread, and moving hot pans with a cloth, because there are no oven mitts to speak of. Your face is flushed red, not from embarrassment, but from actual, literal heat exposure. Sweat dripping steadily enough that you have to wipe your brow with your forearm every few minutes just to keep it out of your eyes. The meal itself is often simple by necessity, a pot of something boiled. Bread if you have it, whatever's cheap and filling, because elaborate cooking is a luxury reserved for people whose kitchens have proper ventilation and whose grocery budgets allow for more than the essentials. Still, simple doesn't mean quick, and it doesn't mean the fire burns any cooler just because the meal is humble. By the time dinner's ready, you've spent close to an hour standing over an open flame in full Victorian dress, in a room with no airflow, on one of the hottest days of the year. Your dress clings to you, damp through in patches, your hair has escaped its pins in frizzy strands stuck to your temples, and you haven't even sat down to eat yet. You'll do this again tomorrow, and the day after, because feeding your family doesn't take a break for the weather, no matter how badly you'd like it to. There's a particular exhausted satisfaction in setting a hot meal on the table after all that, watching everyone eat, knowing you made it happen through sheer stubbornness and a willingness to sweat through your own kitchen. It's not glamorous. Nobody's writing odes to it. But every single evening, all across the city, women like you are doing exactly this, quietly turning fire and heat and effort into dinner, one uncomfortable hour at a time. There's a particular vanity, if you can even call it that, in wanting the meal to look decent despite everything working against you, A little care taken in how the bread is sliced, how the bowl is set down, small gestures that cost nothing but effort and matter more than they probably should. Nobody at your table is expecting a feast, and nobody would blame you if the meal were slapdash and hurried. But you find some stubborn pride in doing it properly anyway, heat or no heat, because it's one of the very few things left in your day that you actually get to control. Afterward, once the plates are cleared, the range still radiates warmth into the room for a long while, refusing to let the evening cool the way you'd hoped it might. You crack the door if you can, letting in whatever marginally fresher air the street has to offer, and you wipe down the range's surface out of pure habit, even though you know it'll need doing again tomorrow regardless of how carefully you do it tonight. Habit, in a life this repetitive, becomes its own strange comfort, a rhythm you can lean into even when everything else feels chaotic. You think sometimes, standing there in the fading light with a damp cloth in hand, about how many thousands of meals you've cooked over a fire exactly like this one, and how many thousands more are presumably still ahead of you, an unbroken chain of dinners stretching back before you were born and forward past any point you can currently imagine. It's not a comforting thought exactly, but it's not nothing either. It's proof, in its own quiet way, that the chain has never once broken, and that you tonight are simply the latest link in it. The last of the daylight fades while you're still tidying, and you light a single candle rather than let the range's dying embers do the job, unwilling to coax any more heat out of that particular corner of the room tonight. The small flame throws long shadows across the walls as you finish your evening tasks, a modest, flickering companion for the last quiet stretch of a day that has once again demanded considerably more of you than it ever offered back. You blow it out eventually, not because you're ready for the day to end, but because candles cost money and money is better spent elsewhere, and you sit a while longer in the dark instead, listening to the building settle around you. The darkness itself feels different from the daylight heat somehow, quieter, less demanding, and you let yourself sit inside it a few minutes longer than strictly necessary before finally rising to see to the last of the evening's small tasks. By the time you're truly finished, banking whatever's left of the fire and setting the room in order for the night, the last of the day's light has fully gone, and you find your way to bed as much by memory and habit as by any actual visibility, having long since learned every inch of this small room well enough to navigate it blind. If you're lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to have a factory job, your day started before dawn, and will not end until well after your body has given up negotiating. The mill floor is loud, airless, and packed with machinery that generates its own personal weather system. Heat. You clocked in before the sun had properly committed to the day, and you won't clock out until it's well on its way down again, 12 hours bracketed around whatever brief pause you're allowed for a midday meal. The mill itself is a long brick building with high windows that let in light but very little air, because ventilation was never really part of the design, productivity was. Inside, the machinery runs constantly, hundreds of spindles or looms all working at once, and every single one of them generates heat as a byproduct of simply operating. Multiply that by a room full of machines, add the body heat of every worker packed in alongside you, and you get a floor temperature that climbs steadily from uncomfortable at 7 in the morning to genuinely dangerous by early afternoon, especially once the summer sun starts baking that high roof from above. You stand at your machine, because sitting isn't really an option when you need to react instantly to snapped threads or jammed mechanisms, and you feel the heat rising off the equipment in front of you, like standing too close to a radiator that never switches off. The air is thick with cotton lint, tiny fibres floating everywhere, catching in your throat with every breath, mixing with sweat to form a fine paste on your skin that no amount of wiping seems to fully remove. The noise alone would be exhausting even in comfortable temperatures, a constant mechanical roar that means you communicate with hand signals and shouted half words rather than actual conversation. Add heat exhaustion creeping in around the edges of your vision, a slight wooziness that you push through because stopping isn't really an option, and the shift becomes less about skill and more about sheer endurance. Try to imagine standing for 12 hours beside a running dishwasher, dryer and space heater all at once, in a room with 300 other people doing the exact same thing, wearing long sleeves, unable to step outside for fresh air because there is no such break scheduled, and you'll start to get a sense of the mill floor in July. Except unlike your dishwasher, this machine doesn't forgive a moment's inattention. Distracted, dizzy workers lose fingers here. The heat isn't just miserable, it's actively dangerous, dulling reflexes exactly when sharp ones matter most. Overseers walk the floor watching for slacking rather than watching for heat stroke, because production quotas don't adjust for temperature, and neither, generally, does anyone's sympathy. If you slow down, you're docked pay. If you faint, and women do faint, regularly in weather like this, you're carried out, revived if possible, and expected back at your machine as soon as you can stand, because the mill has no interest in your well-being beyond your ability to keep working. Water is available, technically, though not always convenient, and not always particularly clean by the time it reaches you second-hand from a shared pitcher passed down the line. Still, you drink what you can, when you can, because dehydration on a mill floor in a heatwave isn't a minor inconvenience. It's how women end up collapsed on the ground with their co-workers fanning them with aprons while the machines keep running around them, indifferent. By the time the closing bell rings, you're moving on autopilot, ears ringing from the noise, skin coated in a mixture of sweat and cotton dust, legs aching from 12 hours upright. You step outside into the evening air, and even though it's still warm, even though summer hasn't let up one bit, it feels like relief simply because it isn't mill air, thick with lint and mechanical heat and the particular exhaustion of a body that's been standing at attention since before sunrise. Tomorrow you'll do it again. The mill doesn't observe heat waves as a reason to slow down, only as one more obstacle standing between you and your wage, and you'll cross that street back toward it in the morning, already tired, already sweating, because the alternative to 12 hours in that heat is no wage at all, and that's a trade you genuinely cannot afford to make. There's talk, always talk, among the women on the mill floor about whether things might someday be different. Shorter hours, better ventilation, some acknowledgement from above that human bodies have limits even when production quotas don't. You've heard the talk for years now, in one form or another, and you've learned to hold it loosely, neither dismissing it outright nor letting yourself hope too hard. Because hope, in a place like this, has a way of curdling into disappointment faster than milk left out in the heat. Your hands, by the end of a long shift, have developed their own particular vocabulary of aches, a stiffness in the fingers from constant fine motion, a rawness across the palms from handling rough thread all day, small nicks and scrapes that you've stopped bothering to tend individually because there are simply too many of them to fuss over. You wrap the worst of them at night with whatever clean cloth you can spare and hope they've closed enough by morning not to catch on the machinery again. Walking home, you pass other mill girls heading the same direction, all of you moving with the same particular gait of people whose legs have been standing at attention for 12 straight hours, a kind of stiff, deliberate shuffle that says more about the day than words would. Nobody talks much on this stretch of the walk. There's an unspoken understanding that after a shift like that, silence is its own small mercy, and you extend it to each other freely, the way exhausted people extend the few kindnesses still within their reach. At your own door, you pause for just a moment before going in, letting the quiet settle over you one last time before the household's own noise and needs take over completely. It's a brief transition, barely long enough to count as a rest, but it marks, however small, the boundary between the day that belonged to the mill and the evening that, at least in theory, belongs to you. Inside, the household's evening business awaits regardless, but you've learned to claim that brief threshold moment as entirely your own, a habit small enough that nobody else has ever noticed you doing it, and private enough that you intend to keep it that way. It costs nothing, this small ritual, and asks nothing of anyone else, which is precisely what makes it worth protecting in a life where so very little else is entirely uncomplicatedly your own. Most of what fills your day belongs, in one way or another, to someone else. Your labour to an employer, your time to your family, your body's endurance to whatever task currently demands it. So these small unclaimed minutes, threshold moments, and quiet pauses, and brief private thoughts take on an outsized importance precisely because they're so rare. You've become something of a connoisseur of them without ever meaning to, learning exactly where in the day's structure these little pockets of ownership tend to hide, and guarding them fiercely once you've found them. It's a modest kind of wealth, admittedly, measured not in coin but in stolen minutes, yet you find yourself, some evenings, feeling almost rich in it, richer at least than the accounting of your actual finances would ever suggest. Wealth, you've decided, this particular summer, might simply mean having a few minutes each day that genuinely belong to no one but yourself, and by that measure, you're doing better than you sometimes give yourself credit for. This is the summer London will remember for one very specific, very unfortunate reason. The Thames has begun to smell like the end of the world, and you live close enough to appreciate it fully, whether you want to or not. For years, the city's waste, human, animal, and industrial, has flowed more or less directly into the river, because a proper sewer system is still more idea than reality. Most summers, this is merely unpleasant. This summer, with the heat pressing down day after day without relief, the river has essentially begun to cook, and the whole city is trapped downwind of the results. You notice it before you even leave your building, a low, sour, rotten smell that seems to seep in through every crack, every ill-fitting window, every gap around the door. It's not a smell you get used to exactly. It's more a smell you learn to function despite, the way you might learn to keep working through a headache that never quite goes away. Newspapers are calling it the Great Stink, and it's not an exaggeration for effect. It's a fairly literal description. Members of Parliament, sitting in buildings right along the riverbank, have reportedly taken to soaking their curtains in chemicals just to make their own chambers bearable. If the people in charge of the country can't stand to be near it even briefly, you might wonder what exactly it's like for the people who live, cook, sleep, and raise children within constant range of it, day and night with nowhere else to go. You do your washing, your cooking, your daily errands, all within this haze of a smell that seems to intensify with every degree the temperature climbs, heat drawing the stench up off the water and spreading it through streets and alleys like a slow, invisible fog. Try to imagine your own neighbourhood permanently smelling like the inside of a dumpster on the hottest day of summer, except you can't roll up your car window and drive away from it, because you live inside it, and you will keep living inside it until the weather finally breaks. Meals taste different when the air itself smells like rot. You find yourself breathing through your mouth more than you'd like to admit, holding your breath at certain corners the way you might hold it, walking past something dead in the road. Except this isn't one dead thing. It's an entire river's worth, cooking gently under a relentless sun. Flies seem to multiply in direct proportion to the smell, drawn to whatever's fermenting along the banks, and they don't stay politely by the river. They follow the scent trail straight into your kitchen, your washing, your children's food. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from simply existing inside a smell this persistent. It's not painful exactly, not the way a burn or a blister is painful, but it wears on you steadily, a low background misery layered on top of the heat, the labour, and everything else the day demands of you. You catch yourself more than once, pressing a cloth to your nose and mouth as you pass certain streets, a small, mostly futile gesture against a problem far too large for a handkerchief to solve. The wealthier residents of the city have options you don't. Some have simply left, decamping to the countryside for the worst of the summer, letting their townhouses sit empty and odourless until the weather cools. You have no countryside to decamp to. Your work is here, your home is here, your entire life is tethered to a city that has, this particular summer, become almost unbearably hard to breathe in, and leaving simply isn't a choice available to you. So you carry on the way you carry on through everything else, adjusting, coping, finding small ways to make it marginally more bearable, a sprig of something fragrant tucked near your collar. If you can spare it, windows kept shut despite the heat, because shut windows at least keep out the worst of it. It's not a solution. It's survival. The same quiet, stubborn survival that gets you through every other part of this heatwave, one held breath at a time, waiting for a break in the weather that so far shows absolutely no sign of coming. You've noticed the birds have gone quieter along the stretches nearest the water, as if even they've decided the riverbank isn't worth the trouble this particular summer. The absence is stranger than the smell itself somehow, a kind of unnatural hush hanging over a part of the city that's usually alive with gulls and sparrows and the general business of urban wildlife. When you do hear birdsong now, it comes from further inland, from the small scrappy trees planted near the church, as though the animals themselves have quietly relocated their opinion of which streets are still livable. There's a rumour going around, as there always is in weather like this, that the smell has grown so bad it's begun to affect trade along the river, boats delayed, cargo left sitting longer than it should because nobody wants to linger at the wharves any longer than absolutely necessary. You have no way to verify any of this yourself, but it fits with what you can see from your own small corner of the city. A general slowing, a general reluctance, everyone moving through their obligations near the water with their heads down and their breath held. Even the coolest hour of the evening, the one small window when the temperature usually dips enough to offer some relief, doesn't bring the smell down with it. If anything, the stillness of dusk seems to let it settle even more thoroughly over the streets, hanging in the windless air like something that's decided to stay for good. You close your shutters a little earlier than you might otherwise, trading a few extra minutes of stuffy warmth for a few extra minutes, without that particular smell filling your one small room. You find yourself, some evenings, thinking almost fondly of the smell of coal smoke by comparison, a scent you'd have called unpleasant in any other summer, but which now, set against the river's particular contribution to the air, seems almost neutral. Perspective, you've learned this season, is a strange and flexible thing, capable of making even coal smoke seem like a modest mercy when the alternative is worse. You wonder, idly, whether the river will ever truly be fixed, whether some future generation might grow up never knowing this particular smell at all, and the thought feels almost fantastical, a comfort too distant and unlikely to be worth dwelling on for very long. You turn your attention back instead to the present, practical business of getting through today's stretch of it, one held breath and one closed window at a time, because tomorrow's river, whatever it eventually becomes, isn't the one you have to survive right now. Today's version is quite enough to contend with on its own, thank you, and you've learned this summer to keep your focus narrowed to exactly that, the day directly in front of you, rather than exhausting yourself worrying over a future you have no real power to hurry along. If you have an infant, summer brings its own quiet terror, because milk spoils fast in this heat and clean water is a luxury item, and every mother in your street is doing the same math you are, how many hours before this becomes dangerous. If you're able to nurse your baby yourself, you're doing the safest thing available to you, and you know it, because the alternative, feeding a baby cow's milk or some watered-down substitute in this heat, is a genuine gamble with your child's life. But nursing brings its own exhaustion, your own body already depleted by heat, hard labour and insufficient food, now asked to produce nourishment for another person entirely, and there's no extra ration of anything to help you manage it. You sit with your baby in whatever shade or stillness you can find, sweat trickling down your spine, your infant equally flushed and fretful in the heat, neither of you getting much relief from the other's closeness, even though closeness is exactly what's needed right now. Babies don't handle heat well under the best of circumstances, and these are decidedly not the best of circumstances. If you can't nurse, or need to supplement, your options are grim. Cow's milk, if you can get it, has often travelled some distance, unrefrigerated, jostled in cans through hot streets, picking up bacteria the entire way. By the time it reaches your baby's bottle, it may already be turning, and you have no reliable way to know for certain until it's too late. Doctors and mothers alike have started noticing grimly that certain months bring a predictable spike in infant illness and death, and everyone quietly understands why, even without fully understanding the science of it yet. Think about checking milk today. A quick sniff, a glance at the expiration date, total confidence in refrigeration keeping it safe until you need it. Now imagine that same milk sitting out in 90-degree heat for hours before it even reaches you, with no reliable way to test whether it's still safe beyond hoping for the best, and watching your child closely afterward for any sign of trouble. That's the daily reality, and it's terrifying in a way that never quite lets you relax even for a moment. You keep the milk, when you have it, in whatever shaded spot exists, sometimes a cool corner of a stone floor, sometimes wrapped in a damp cloth in a vain attempt to lower its temperature by evaporation. None of it is particularly effective. None of it is a substitute for the refrigeration you don't have and can't get. You do what you can with what's available, and you watch your baby carefully, and you pray, quietly, constantly, that this batch was fine. The heat itself is dangerous for infants, even setting aside the food question entirely. Babies overheat faster than adults, dehydrate faster, and show distress in ways that are easy to miss if you're exhausted and distracted by everything else the day demands. You find yourself checking your baby's forehead, their colour, their breathing, throughout the day, a constant low hum of worry running underneath every other task you're trying to accomplish. Other mothers on your street are managing the exact same fear, and there's a kind of grim solidarity in it. Women swapping advice in doorways, sharing whatever small tricks seem to help. A wet cloth on the back of the neck, keeping the baby out of direct sun. Feeding smaller amounts more frequently rather than large meals that sit heavy in this heat. None of it is medical science exactly. It's accumulated survival knowledge, passed woman to woman, because that's the only resource freely available. By evening, if your baby has made it through the day without fever, without the telltale summer sickness that takes so many infants this time of year, you feel something close to relief, though it's a temporary relief, because tomorrow brings the exact same risks all over again. This is what summer means when you're a poor mother in this city. Not sunshine and long evenings, but a season-long vigil, watching over the most vulnerable person in your life, while the heat and the spoiled milk and the contaminated water all work quietly against you, day after relentless day. You've started keeping a small mental ledger of which households on your street have lost a little one this summer already, not out of morbidity, but out of the same instinct that makes you check a stove is out before leaving a room, a kind of protective vigilance that costs you something every time you update it, but that you can't quite bring yourself to stop doing. Each name on that quiet, unspoken list sharpens your own watchfulness a little further, a reminder wrapped in grief that your own child is not exempt from any of this, simply because you love them fiercely. Your own mother, when she visits, presses a hand to the baby's forehead the way her mother once did to her, an old gesture passed down through generations of women who had no thermometer and no doctor on retainer, just their own palms and their own accumulated worry as their primary diagnostic tools. She tells you what she remembers helping with her own children, half-remembered fragments of advice that may or may not actually help, and you take all of it in gladly anyway, because in the absence of anything more reliable, inherited worry is at least a kind of company. At night, when the baby finally sleeps, you find yourself listening to their breathing longer than is strictly necessary. One hand resting lightly on the small chest just to feel it rise and fall, proof that the day's dangers have, for now, been successfully outrun. It's a small ritual, unremarkable to anyone but you, and it's also, quietly, the closest thing to prayer you manage most nights this summer. You've thought, once or twice, about what you'd say if you ever met the mothers of grander households, whether they lie awake with this same particular fear, or whether reliable ice and clean milk and a doctor on call have spared them this specific flavour of nightly dread. You suspect the answer, whatever it is, wouldn't change anything about your own situation, but you find yourself wondering about it anyway, in the quiet hours when sleep still hasn't come. Eventually your own eyes grow heavy despite the vigilance, and you allow yourself a light, watchful doze rather than true sleep, one ear still tuned to the baby's breathing, even as exhaustion finally briefly wins out over worry. Morning, when it arrives, finds you stiff and unrested, but grateful all the same. The baby's steady breathing beside you, the only confirmation you actually need that the night, against everything working against it, passed safely after all. You allow yourself exactly one long, grateful breath before the day's obligations reassert themselves, because gratitude, however genuine, has never once bought you an extra hour of rest, and there's water to fetch and a fire to consider, and an infant who'll need feeding again shortly, heatwave or no heatwave, night survived or not. If you work in service, your comfort was never really part of the arrangement, but summer makes that especially clear, as you're expected to keep every fire lit, every fireplace polished, and every window shut to keep out bad air, all while wearing a uniform designed by someone who has never once been warm. You rise before your employers, as always, in a small attic bedroom directly beneath the roof, which, as established, is essentially a slow oven all summer long. Your uniform is laid out ready, a dark high-neck dress, a stiff apron, a cap, none of it chosen with your comfort in mind, all of it chosen to present a tidy, respectable appearance to a household that will barely register your presence unless something goes wrong. Downstairs, the household still runs on the same schedule it does every other day of the year, fires laid in the mornings even though nobody particularly needs the warmth, because the routines of a proper household don't pause for a heatwave. They simply carry on as though the temperature outside were purely a matter of scenery, rather than something anyone should adjust their behaviour around. You carry coal scuttles up staircases that seem to get longer every day, laying and lighting fires in rooms that are already stiflingly warm, because certain rituals of the house, morning fires among them, are simply how things are done, and questioning them isn't really within your job description. You feel faintly absurd doing it, sweat already beading at your hairline before 8 in the morning, kneeling at a hearth to add heat to a house that has entirely too much of it already. The windows, meanwhile, stay largely shut, partly out of habit, partly because there's still a lingering belief among some households that night, air and open windows invite illness, a notion that does nothing for the heat, but persists anyway because it's what's always been done. You move through rooms that have been sealed against fresh air all night, stale and warm, dusting, polishing, sweeping, all while dressed in layers that were selected for propriety rather than practicality. Imagine, for a moment, working a full shift in a heavy uniform, no air conditioning, expected to maintain a cheerful, composed demeanour at all times regardless of how you actually feel, while also being essentially invisible to the people you're working for unless a task is done imperfectly. Your employer might comment mildly on how warm it is today, sipping something cool a moment later, entirely unaware or entirely uninterested in the fact that you've been sweating through your uniform since sunrise while tending fires for their comfort. There's a strange loneliness to service work in weather like this, because you're constantly present in a household's daily life, yet entirely separate from its comforts. The family might retreat to a shaded garden, or a cooler parlour in the afternoon, fanning themselves and remarking on the weather as though it were an amusing topic of conversation rather than a genuine physical trial, while you're in the kitchen or the laundry, doing the actual labour that keeps their household functioning through it. Meals below stairs are eaten quickly, standing or seated briefly at a servant's table, no leisurely afternoon rest, no siesta from the heat, just a short pause before the next task calls you back. You might catch a moment near an open kitchen door, feeling whatever faint breeze manages to find its way in, and treasure it the way you'd treasure any small mercy. Because small mercies are largely what you're working with here. By evening, once the family has been fed, the rooms tidied, the fires banked for the night despite the warmth, you finally climb back up to your attic room, exhausted, damp through, and ready to lie down in the exact same overheated space you woke up in, because your workday doesn't come with a change of scenery, just a change of task. Tomorrow the fires will need laying again, the windows will stay shut again, and the household will carry on exactly as before, largely unaware of just how much heat, effort and quiet endurance it takes to keep their comfortable world running smoothly around them. You share your small attic space with another maid from the household, and the two of you have developed, out of necessity, a quiet camaraderie built almost entirely around complaining softly about the heat once the door is finally shut and no one downstairs can hear. It's not much, this nightly ritual of shared grumbling, but it's yours, one of the very few things in your day that belongs entirely to you and not to your employers, and you guard that small privacy carefully. Occasionally, if the mistress of the house is feeling particularly generous or particularly guilty about something entirely unrelated, you might be handed a small glass of something cool, lemon water or weak tea gone cold, a gesture that costs her nothing and means to you rather more than she probably intends. You drink it slowly, savouring it, aware that gestures like this are rare enough that you'll likely remember this particular evening long after you've forgotten dozens of others exactly like it in every other respect. Below you, through the thin attic floorboards, you can just make out the muffled sounds of the family settling in for their own evening, quiet conversation, the clink of glassware, a life running along entirely different rules than yours despite happening within arm's reach. You've stopped finding it strange, mostly. It's simply the shape of the world you work inside, two households sharing one roof, one set of comforts flowing generously to one group and rationed carefully to the other. Before sleep finally takes you, you allow yourself one small private thought, a modest wage owed to you at the end of the month, a half-day off promised for church you intend to actually collect on this time. Small anchors like these, planted a few days or weeks into the future, help carry you through the exhaustion of any single evening, proof that tomorrow and the day after are not entirely without their own small mercies waiting somewhere ahead. Your fellow maid's breathing evens out into sleep beside you before your own thoughts have finished circling, and you envy her briefly for it before finally, gradually, following her down into the same overdue rest. Morning arrives, as it always does, with the same bell, the same coal scuttle waiting, the same climb down from the attic into another day indistinguishable from the last, and you rise to meet it the way you rise to meet every one of them, without much ceremony, but without complaint either. There's a kind of quiet dignity in that lack of complaint, you've come to think. Not resignation exactly, more a settled understanding that complaining has never once shortened a single one of these long hot days, and that your energy is better spent simply getting through them than spent lamenting how difficult they are. Out on the pavement with a basket or a barrow you're selling watercress or fish or fruit, standing in direct sun for hours, hoping your stock doesn't spoil faster than you can sell it, which in this heat is a real and constant race. You've been up since before dawn, down at the market to buy your stock while it's still fresh, because fresh doesn't last long in weather like this, and every hour that passes between purchase and sale is an hour working against you. You load your basket or your barrow, balance it however you've learned to over years of practice, and head out to your usual corner, your usual street, your usual patch of pavement that you've claimed through sheer persistence and familiarity. There's no awning provided for you, no shade structure, no umbrella unless you've managed to fashion or afford one yourself. You stand or crouch beside your barrow, directly under a sun that climbs steadily higher through the morning, calling out your wares in a voice that has to compete with cartwheels, other vendors, and the general roar of a city going about its business, all while the sun works steadily on both you and your stock. Watercress wilts within hours in this heat, going from crisp and sellable to limp and unappealing faster than you can move your inventory. Fish, if that's your trade, is even less forgiving, the smell turning within a remarkably short window, and you're constantly calculating, adjusting your prices downward as the day wears on, trying to sell everything before it becomes not just unsellable, but actively unsafe. Fruit bruises and softens, flies gathering with an enthusiasm that seems to increase in direct proportion to the temperature. Think about standing outside, no shade, for 8 or 10 hours straight, in direct sun, wearing long sleeves and a full skirt, trying to project a cheerful, persuasive sales patter while your merchandise visibly deteriorates in front of you and the customers you need. There's no walking inside for a break. There's no cooler you can tuck your stock into. There's just you, your goods, and a sun that doesn't care whether you make your day's earnings or not. Your face and arms, the parts of you exposed to the sun day after day, are browning and freckling in a way that marks you instantly, to anyone who looks, as someone who labours outdoors rather than someone who can afford to stay shaded and pale. It's not a look anyone's chasing. It's simply the visible cost of standing in the sun for a living, a badge you didn't ask for and can't really avoid. Your feet ache from standing on hard pavement that's radiating heat back up at you nearly as fiercely as the sun beats down from above, a kind of heat sandwich that leaves no part of you actually cool. You shift your weight from foot to foot, fan yourself with whatever's handy between customers, and keep calling out, because silence means no sales, and no sales means a wasted trip to the market this morning and very little to show for a full day's effort. By afternoon, whatever hasn't sold is becoming a liability rather than an asset, and you start dropping prices just to move it, accepting less than you'd hoped for rather than carrying home spoiled stock that represents money you've already spent and can't get back. Some days this works out reasonably well. Other days, especially in weather this punishing, you're left calculating a loss, standing amid the wreckage of wilted greens or unsold fish, wondering how you'll make up the difference tomorrow. As the sun finally starts to dip, you pack up whatever's left, your barrow lighter but your earnings thinner than you'd hoped, and you make your way home, sunburned, exhausted, and already thinking about tomorrow's market run, because there's no day off built into this arrangement, no sick leave, no weather contingency. Tomorrow you'll do it all again, out on the same corner, under the same relentless sun, selling whatever the day brings before the heat claims it first. Other vendors on your stretch of pavement have become something like colleagues over the years, a loose, informal network of women who watch each other's barrows during a quick errand, share news about which streets have the best foot traffic on a given day, and occasionally pool resources to buy a bit of ice for the worst of the heat, splitting both the cost and the relief between however many of you can afford to chip in. It's not charity exactly. It's simply practical solidarity between women who understand that none of them can afford to go it entirely alone. You've developed, out of pure repetition, an intuition for which customers will actually buy, and which are merely pausing to look, a skill that saves you precious energy on days when energy is in desperately short supply. A slight tilt of the head, a lingering glance at the price rather than the goods, the particular way someone's hand hovers without quite reaching, all of it tells you something, and you've learned to read these small signals the way a more educated woman might read a book. Your voice, by late afternoon, has gone rough from hours of calling out over the general noise of the street, and you find yourself rationing it a little, saving your energy for the customers who seem genuinely interested rather than spending it freely on everyone who passes. It's a small economy of effort, one among many you've had to learn this summer, husbanding your limited resources, physical and vocal alike, against a day that has no intention of making any of it easy for you. A regular customer, an elderly man who buys the same small bundle of watercress most afternoons, always exchanges a few kind words along with his coin, and you find yourself more than you'd expect looking forward to that brief, ordinary kindness in the middle of an otherwise punishing stretch of pavement. He tips his hat slightly each time before moving on, an old-fashioned courtesy that costs him nothing and means to you a small reminder that not every interaction in a day like this has to be transactional and exhausting. Even the walk home carries its own small negotiations, which route offers the most shade at this particular hour, which shortcut saves enough time to be worth the extra dust it kicks up. You've mapped this small corner of the city in ways that have nothing to do with street names and everything to do with survival, a private geography built entirely out of necessity and years of trudging the same weary path. Nobody taught you this map deliberately. You built it yourself, step by step, season by season, the way anyone builds real expertise in anything, through sheer repetition and a stubborn refusal to keep making the same mistakes twice. It's a kind of knowledge nobody will ever write down in any book, invisible to anyone who hasn't walked these exact streets in this exact heat, and yet it's every bit as real and every bit as hard-won as anything taught in a proper schoolroom, even if no one but you will ever know its full extent. Your room isn't just yours, it's yours and your husband's and your children's and possibly a cousin's, all sharing air that was already used up sometime around Tuesday, in a building where ventilation was clearly not part of anyone's plan. Space, in your building, is a negotiation nobody ever formally agreed to, but everyone silently participates in. One room, maybe two if you're doing reasonably well, houses your entire family, and in a heat wave, that arrangement stops being merely cramped and starts feeling almost hostile. Every extra body in the room another small heat source nobody can switch off. The building itself was never designed with airflow in mind. It was designed to fit as many paying tenants as possible into as little space as possible, which means thin walls, low ceilings and windows that, where they exist at all, rarely align in any way that might create an actual cross breeze. Heat that builds up during the day has nowhere to go, so it simply stays, settling into every room like an uninvited, extremely persistent guest. At night, when you'd normally expect at least some relief, the building holds its heat with real dedication. Brick and plaster that absorbed sun all day release it slowly after dark, so your room stays warm well past sunset, long after the temperature outside has started, at least marginally, to drop. You lie there with your family, all of you too warm, too close together, too aware of each other's breathing and shifting in a space that offers no possibility of spreading out. Consider your own home during a heat wave, and how unbearable it feels even with air conditioning struggling to keep up, even with room to walk from one space to another looking for a slightly cooler spot. Now, shrink that entire home down to a single room, remove the air conditioning entirely, add several more people, and seal most of the windows shut, and you've got a reasonably accurate picture of a tenement bedroom on a July night in this city. The building around you is equally packed, family after family stacked into rooms up and down every floor, and the heat they generate doesn't stay politely contained to their own spaces either. It seeps through floorboards, through shared walls, through the stairwell that acts less like a hallway and more like a chimney, drawing warm air up through the entire structure. Your neighbours' cooking fires, their own body heat, their own struggles with the exact same weather, all contribute to a building that runs warmer overall than the street outside it. Privacy, already a rare commodity, becomes almost non-existent in this heat, because everyone's doors and whatever windows exist tend to stay open, in a desperate, largely symbolic attempt to generate airflow, which means sounds, smells, and the general business of every family on your floor become communal property, whether anyone particularly wants that or not. You hear your neighbours' arguments, their children crying, their own quiet complaints about the heat, layered right alongside your own. Disease spreads easily in conditions like these even outside of heatwave season, and summer heat makes everything worse, close quarters accelerating the reach of anything contagious moving through the building. You watch your children carefully, aware that overcrowding and heat together create exactly the conditions doctors warn about, though knowing the danger doesn't actually give you anywhere else to live. There's no solution available to you here, no moving to somewhere more spacious, no simply deciding to spread out. This room, shared and stifling, is what your wages afford, and it will remain what your wages afford until circumstances change dramatically, which they show no particular sign of doing. So you make the best of it, sharing the small mercies where you find them, a slightly cooler corner near the door, a moment of quiet after everyone's finally settled, and you wait, the way you wait for most things this summer, for a break in the weather that would make this arrangement even slightly more bearable. You've learned the particular geography of your building intimately, which floors run hottest, which stairwell landing catches the faintest cross-draft on the rare occasion one exists, which neighbour's door, left propped open a crack, tends to let a little more air circulate than most. It's a kind of expertise nobody would ever think to ask you about, entirely invisible to anyone outside these walls, but it shapes your evenings all the same. Small navigational choices made instinctively after years of living inside the same overheated structure. The landlord, when he comes round to collect rent, never lingers long enough to notice the conditions he's charging for, moving briskly from door to door with his ledger tucked under one arm, unbothered by heat. He doesn't have to actually live inside. You've considered, more than once, mentioning the windows that don't open properly, the roof that traps heat like a kiln. But you've also watched other tenants raise similar complaints and receive nothing but a vague promise and a slightly raised rent the following quarter. So mostly you've learned to simply keep your grievances to yourself. At the very worst of the evening heat, some families have taken to sitting out on the front step instead, trading the crowded stuffiness of the room for the crowded stuffiness of the street, at least there being some illusion of open air even if the actual temperature barely differs. You join them some nights, perched on the worn stone alongside neighbours doing exactly the same calculation, all of you silently agreeing that marginal relief, however marginal, is still worth chasing. Someone occasionally brings out a bit of bread to share, or a story worth telling, and these small, spontaneous front step gatherings have become, this summer, one of the few genuinely pleasant fixtures of an otherwise relentlessly difficult season. The children take these front step evenings as a kind of holiday, chasing each other in the last of the daylight while the adults sit talking quietly nearby, and there's something almost pleasant about it. Despite the circumstances, a small unplanned gathering of neighbours that the heat, for all its cruelty, has at least indirectly made possible. The front step also becomes, by unspoken agreement, the evening's primary source of entertainment, since none of you can afford anything resembling actual entertainment, and the heat has ruled out most other options anyway. Someone's uncle, 3 doors down, tells the same 3 stories he's told all summer, and somehow they're funnier every single time, either because he's improving with practice or because everyone's simply too tired to demand anything better. You laugh anyway. It costs nothing, and tonight, cost is the only metric that matters. Someone always claims the heat is finally breaking, has been claiming it every single evening for a month, and every single evening they're wrong, and every single evening the rest of the step humours them anyway, because hope, however repeatedly disproven, is apparently a renewable resource. You've started taking quiet bets with yourself on how long it'll take before someone says it, and you're rarely disappointed. The children, once thoroughly worn out from their stepside games, start drifting towards sleep right there on the stone, heads in laps, sprawled in the kind of unself-conscious exhaustion only the very young can manage in public. Nobody rushes to move them. There's something almost sacred about a sleeping child who isn't currently complaining about the heat, and everyone on the step seems to instinctively understand that this fragile piece shouldn't be disturbed a moment sooner than necessary. Eventually, though, the step empties out one family at a time, each retreat back indoors negotiated silently. A kind of unspoken agreement that everyone's had roughly the same amount of relief, and it's time to trade the illusion of open air for an actual bed, however overheated that bed happens to be. You gather your own children last, always last, savouring the final few minutes of relative cool before the room reclaims you. Back inside, the room greets you exactly as warm as you left it, patient and unbothered by your brief absence, and you settle back into the same crowded arrangement you've been managing all summer. Slightly more prepared for it now, however marginally, thanks to 20 minutes of pretending the outdoors was any cooler than the indoors. It wasn't, not really. But the pretending, it turns out, is doing quite a lot of the actual emotional work here, and you'll take whatever help you can get. You've noticed too that the front step ritual has quietly rearranged the whole street's social order for the summer. Families who'd normally exchange nothing more than a polite nod, now trading bread, gossip, and the occasional childcare favour purely because the heat has forced everyone outside at the same predictable hour. It's a strange kind of silver lining, one you'd never have predicted and wouldn't have asked for. A neighbourhood drawn closer together by nothing more than shared, stubborn discomfort. There's no icebox, no refrigerator, nothing but a shelf and good intentions, and in a heatwave that means every piece of meat, milk or butter you own is racing against the clock, and the clock is winning. Every purchase you make at market becomes immediately a small race against time and temperature. Meat bought this morning needs to be cooked and eaten today, not tomorrow, because tomorrow it won't be safe, and you know this, and you plan your entire day's cooking around it rather than any actual preference for what you'd like to eat. Butter softens to a useless puddle within hours of leaving the shop. Milk turns before you've even finished carrying it home some days, souring in the jug on the walk back. You have a shelf, maybe a small cupboard, set in whatever corner of the room stays relatively coolest, though relatively coolest in a heatwave still means considerably warmer than anything you'd trust today. Some households manage a cellar or a shared cool space in the building, and if you have access to one, you treasure it, making extra trips down and up just to store things somewhere marginally safer from spoilage. Most don't have this luxury, and simply do their best with a shelf and a damp cloth draped over whatever needs protecting. Ice, when it exists at all in this city, is a commodity for the wealthy, delivered by cart, stored in specially built ice houses, used to keep entire households' worth of food fresh through the summer. You've perhaps seen an ice delivery cart trundling toward a grander part of town, and felt the particular sting of watching a resource you'll never touch roll right past your own street. For you, the coldest available surface is whatever stone or tile floor happens to be shaded, and that's simply not cold enough to matter much. Think about your own refrigerator, humming quietly, holding days' worth of groceries at a safe, steady temperature, without you having to think about it even once. Now imagine buying groceries for one meal at a time, every single day, because storage isn't an option, and even that same-day food needs to be watched constantly for the first signs of turning, a slight smell, a change in texture, a colour that's just slightly off from what it should be. You've become, out of necessity, quite skilled at judging exactly how far you can push a piece of meat, or a bit of milk before it crosses from edible to dangerous, a skill nobody particularly wants to have. But everyone in your position develops fast because getting it wrong means illness, sometimes serious illness. In a household that can't afford a doctor's visit on top of everything else, this season is already costing you. Preservation methods help where they can. Salting meat, pickling vegetables, making jams thick enough with sugar to resist spoiling as quickly. But these all take time, fuel, and ingredients you don't always have spare, and they only stretch things so far in weather determined to work against you. Bread goes stale and mouldy faster too, the warm, humid air practically inviting mould to take hold within a day or two, rather than the week it might manage in cooler months. So your meals this summer are smaller, more frequent trips to market, more careful planning, more waste when you misjudge and have to throw something out rather than risk feeding it to your family. It's an exhausting, constant calculation layered on top of everything else you're managing. One more way this heat quietly drains your resources, your time and your patience, a little more each day. By the time you've successfully gotten a safe meal onto the table, you've fought for it in ways that have nothing to do with cooking skill and everything to do with logistics, timing, and a certain grim vigilance against a season that seems determined to spoil everything you touch before you can use it. You've grown suspicious this summer of anything that smells even faintly off, holding jugs of milk up to your nose before pouring, checking meat with a wariness that borders on paranoia, but has more than once saved you from serving something that would have made the whole family ill. It's exhausting, this constant low-level detective work layered onto every single meal, but the alternative, trusting blindly and hoping for the best, feels like a gamble you simply can't afford to keep taking. Your neighbour, 2 doors down, lost nearly a week's wages when an entire delivery of meat turned before she could use half of it, and the story has stuck with you since. A cautionary tale you find yourself thinking about every time you're tempted to stretch a purchase one day longer than you probably should. Money wasted on spoiled food isn't just wasted money, it's wasted labour too. Hours you spent earning it now gone for nothing, and that particular calculation keeps you more careful than you might otherwise bother to be. Some evenings, when everything has gone right, when the meat was fresh, and the milk hadn't turned, and the bread wasn't yet showing spots of mould, you feel a small, disproportionate pride in it, as if you've won some minor contest against the season itself. It is, in its own small way, exactly that. Every safe meal this summer is a tiny victory wrestled away from weather that would clearly prefer you lost. You've taken to keeping a small mental list of which shops seem most reliable, which vendors' meat you've never once had trouble with, which stall's milk always seems just slightly fresher than the rest. It's not a scientific system by any means, more accumulated trust built through trial and error, but it's yours, and it's saved you more than once from a purchase you'd have regretted within hours. You trade this hard-won knowledge freely with neighbours too, a favour extended without expectation of anything beyond the same courtesy, returned someday, a small informal economy of trust that matters more in weather like this than it might in any milder season. It's the kind of quiet mutual aid that never gets written down anywhere, never gets credited to anyone in particular, but that holds an entire street together all the same, one small shared warning or shared tip at a time. It costs nothing to pass along this kind of knowledge, and yet its value is nearly impossible to overstate, a form of wealth that circulates freely among women who have almost nothing else in the way of resources to share with one another. You've come to rely on it more than you'd ever officially admit, this informal web of shared knowledge stretched across every household on your street, each woman contributing whatever small piece of hard-won wisdom she happens to have, until, together, you know considerably more than any one of you could ever have managed to learn entirely alone. A proper bath requires hauled water, a heated copper, and time you do not have, so on a hot day you make do with a flannel, a basin, and a great deal of denial about how you smell by 4 in the afternoon. A full bath, the kind where you actually submerge and soak, is a production so involved it's essentially reserved for special occasions, not a daily luxury you can casually indulge in. It requires hauling multiple buckets from that pump you already know intimately, heating at least some of that water over a fire you're trying to avoid lighting unnecessarily in this weather, and finding a tub, which, if you have one at all, is probably shared among several households, and requires its own small negotiation to access. So on an ordinary hot day, and there have been nothing but ordinary hot days for what feels like weeks now, you make do with what's called a strip wash, a basin of water, a flannel, and a quick practical once-over rather than any real cleansing. You wash your face, your neck, under your arms if you can manage the privacy, and you call it good enough, because good enough is genuinely all that's available to you today. The trouble is that good enough doesn't hold up particularly well against a full day of sweating through wool in 90-degree heat, hauling water, boiling laundry, and standing over a hot range. By midday, you're aware, uncomfortably aware, of exactly how you smell, and there's very little you can do about it beyond that same quick flannel wipe repeated whenever you get a spare moment, which isn't often. Consider for a moment going through your entire day without a proper shower, no deodorant, no quick rinse when you're feeling grimy, just a damp cloth and sheer willpower, while performing hard physical labour in full Victorian dress. By evening, you'd have a fairly strong opinion about your own hygiene situation, and so does everyone around you, because you're not alone in this. Your neighbours, your co-workers, everyone on your street is managing the exact same limitations, which creates a strange sort of collective understanding. Nobody smells particularly wonderful this week, and pointing it out would be both rude and entirely pointless. There's also a lingering cultural suspicion around bathing itself, a holdover belief in some circles that too much washing strips away natural protections or opens you up to illness, an idea that, mixed with the sheer practical difficulty of bathing properly, gives everyone a convenient excuse to simply not bother more than necessary. You're not entirely sure you believe it yourself, but it's a useful thought to lean on when the alternative is another exhausting round of hauling and heating water you frankly don't have the energy for after the day you've already had. Sunday might bring a slightly more thorough wash if you can manage the time and the water, perhaps sharing a tub with your sister or a friend, taking turns, using the same water because heating fresh water for each person individually simply isn't practical. It's not glamorous, and it's certainly not private by modern standards, but it's the closest thing to real cleanliness you'll manage all week, and you make the most of it while you have the chance. By the time you finally lie down at night, still slightly damp from the day's heat and effort, rather than any proper wash, you've made peace with a version of hygiene that would probably horrify anyone from a century with reliable plumbing. It's not that you don't want to be clean, it's that being clean, this particular summer, costs more time, water, and energy than you can consistently spare, and so you settle, as you settle with so much else this season, for whatever version of clean enough gets you through to tomorrow. There's a particular vanity you allow yourself despite everything, a moment each evening spent brushing out your hair with whatever comb you own, working through the tangles the day's sweat and labour have left behind. It's not vanity in any grand sense, nothing to do with impressing anyone, just a small private ritual that reminds you there's still a person underneath all this grime and exhaustion, someone who once cared, and still quietly cares, about small things like the state of her own hair. You've heard whispered talk of grander households where bathing has become something of a fashionable indulgence, elaborate copper tubs and scented soaps and servants to haul the water, so the lady of the house never has to lift a finger toward her own cleanliness. It sounds, frankly, like something from a fairy story, a version of washing so far removed from your own daily flannel and basin reality that you can barely picture it as belonging to the same century, let alone the same city. On the very hottest nights, when even a strip wash feels like more effort than you can spare, you've taken to simply standing near the open door for a few minutes before bed, letting whatever air moves through the building brush against your damp skin, calling it close enough to cooling off. It isn't much. But little is, this summer, and you've become skilled at stretching very little into something that at least resembles relief. Some nights you catch your own reflection for just a moment in that same small cracked mirror, hair loose, face bare of any pretense, and you allow yourself a brief honest look at the woman staring back, tired but still recognisably yourself underneath all the summer's accumulated grime and exhaustion. It's not vanity, this brief look. It's simply a small act of self-recognition, a reminder that you're still in there. However worn down the season has left you, you set the mirror down again after just a moment, unwilling to linger too long on an image that tells you plainly how tired this summer has made you, and you turn instead toward the bed and toward whatever rest the night is willing to grant. Sleep, when it finally comes, arrives slowly, reluctantly, the way it does most nights this summer, but it comes, and that's more than some nights manage to offer at all. You dream, some nights, of a version of this pregnancy unfolding in cooler weather, a version where your ankles don't swell quite so alarmingly, and your sleep isn't quite so constantly interrupted, and you wake from these small imagined mercies feeling, for just a moment, oddly cheated before remembering, as you always do, that this is simply the summer you were given, and wishing for another one accomplishes nothing beyond wasting the little energy you have to spare. If you're expecting, the heat doesn't pause for you, and neither does the corsetry, the housework, or the general expectation that you'll carry on exactly as normal, swollen ankles and all. Pregnancy in any season here is physically demanding, with no real allowance made for rest, no maternity leave, no lightened workload, unless your own body simply forces the issue by refusing to cooperate. In a heatwave, everything that's already difficult about being pregnant, the exhaustion, the swelling, the constant low simmer of discomfort, intensifies dramatically, layered right on top of a summer that's already testing everyone's limits. Your stays, adjusted somewhat to accommodate your changing shape, but still very much a structured, restrictive garment, sit against skin that's already prone to overheating, thanks to your body doing the considerable work of growing another human being. You lace them looser than you would otherwise, but looser, is a relative term when the fundamental garment was never designed with either pregnancy or extreme heat in mind. Your ankles and feet, already swelling from the simple mechanics of carrying extra weight and extra fluid, swell further still in this heat, your usual shoes fitting tighter by the afternoon than they did that morning. You're on your feet for hours regardless, because the water still needs fetching, the laundry still needs boiling, the meals still need cooking, and nobody's offering to take over your share of any of it just because you're expecting, and it happens to be 90 degrees out. Think about how uncomfortable pregnancy can feel even with air conditioning, even with the option to put your feet up whenever you need to, even with a doctor monitoring you regularly and telling you to stay hydrated and rest when possible. Now remove all of that. Replace the air conditioning with a heatwave and a wool dress. Replace the rest with a full day of physical labour, and replace the doctor's guidance with old wives' advice passed down from your mother and the women on your street, some of it useful, some of it not, none of it backed by any particular medical authority. Dehydration is a real and constant risk, made worse by the fact that clean drinking water isn't always easy to come by, and made worse still by the physical demands placed on you regardless of your condition. You feel lightheaded some afternoons, a wooziness that you try to push through because sitting down for any real length of time isn't really an option when there's work still waiting. But you're also aware, in a low persistent way, that pushing too hard carries its own risks, for you and for the baby you're carrying. The heat disrupts your sleep too, on top of the usual pregnancy discomforts, your body already struggling to find a comfortable position, now doing so in a room that refuses to cool down even after dark. You lie awake more nights than you'd like, uncomfortable, overheated, and increasingly anxious about the birth itself, which is its own significant danger in this era regardless of season, but which somehow feels even more daunting to contemplate while you're this exhausted and this warm. There's no real acknowledgement, from your employer if you're still working, or from the broader rhythm of daily life around you, that pregnancy in extreme heat deserves any particular accommodation. You're expected to manage, the way women around you have always managed, drawing on whatever reserves of stubbornness and endurance you have left after a summer that's already asked so much of everyone. Still, you carry on, quite literally, one heavy, swollen, overheated day at a time, finding whatever small comforts you can, a cool cloth pressed to the back of your neck, a moment sitting in whatever shade exists. The quiet, persistent hope that this heatwave breaks before your time comes, because facing labour in this weather is a thought you try, mostly successfully, not to dwell on too closely until you absolutely have to. The women who've already had children on this street have become, without anyone formally arranging it, your closest source of practical wisdom, sharing whatever they remember about their own pregnancies in this kind of weather, which fabrics breathed better, which food sat easiest on a heat-troubled stomach, which position finally let them sleep for more than an hour at a stretch. None of it is medical in any formal sense, but all of it is hard-won, tested on real bodies in real summers not unlike this one, and you take it in gratefully, storing away whatever might prove useful in the weeks ahead. Your own mother, further along in years now, still remembers her own pregnancies with a specificity that surprises you, recalling exactly which summer was worst, exactly how she managed, exactly what small tricks got her through. There's something steadying in hearing it, proof that this particular kind of suffering has a long history of being survived, that the women in your own family have faced down worse summers than this one, and come out the other side with a baby and, eventually, even a bit of humour about the whole ordeal. You rest a hand against your belly sometimes, in quiet moments, feeling for movement, a small reassurance that whatever this heat is doing to you, the child inside seems for now undisturbed by it. It's a fragile kind of comfort, dependent entirely on continued good luck, but it's the comfort available to you today, and today is, as it has been all summer, the only day you can actually do anything about. You find yourself, in these quiet, pregnant evenings, thinking ahead to autumn more than you usually would, imagining a version of yourself holding a newborn in cooler air, blankets that feel welcome rather than oppressive, a season finally working with you instead of against you. It's a small, private hope, tucked away where the day's exhaustion can't quite reach it, and you guard it carefully, the way you guard anything this summer that still manages to feel like something worth looking forward to. For now, though, autumn remains a distant promise rather than a present comfort, and you turn your attention back to the immediate unglamorous business of simply getting through today, one swollen, overheated hour at a time. It's not a heroic way to spend a pregnancy, this quiet, grinding endurance, but it's honest, and it's yours, and it will, eventually, one way or another, deliver you to the other side of it. You've watched other women on this street cross that same threshold before you, heavy and exhausted one week, upright again with an infant in arms the next. Proof laid out plainly in front of you that the ordeal, however endless it currently feels, does actually have an end waiting on the other side of it. Summer heat isn't just your problem. It's an open invitation to every fly, flea and bedbug in the parish, all of whom seem to agree that your one-room home is the finest real estate available. The warmth that makes your days so miserable is, apparently, ideal breeding weather for absolutely everything with more than 4 legs, and they've all decided collectively and with real enthusiasm that your home is the place to be this summer. Flies multiply with alarming speed once the temperature climbs, drawn to the rubbish piling up in warmer streets, the nearby stables. The general accumulation of waste that summer heat makes so much more fragrant and so much more attractive to them. They follow you indoors without hesitation, settling on anything remotely edible almost the moment you set it down, requiring constant vigilance over food that's already fighting a losing battle against spoilage without insects speeding the process along. You wave a cloth over your table more times in an afternoon than you'd care to count, a small, mostly futile gesture against an enemy that simply regroups and returns the moment you turn your attention elsewhere. Fleas thrive in the heat too, breeding readily in bedding, in floor cracks, in the general accumulated dust and debris of a home that doesn't have the luxury of thorough, frequent deep cleaning. You scratch at bites along your arms and ankles more than usual this season, small itchy welts that you've simply learned to live with rather than any problem you have real hope of solving entirely. Bedbugs, patient and persistent year-round, seem especially active in warm weather, and a shared mattress in a shared room offers them exactly the environment they thrive in. You check the seams of your bedding when you have a spare moment, a grim little ritual that rarely turns up good news, and you do what you can, airing bedding out in whatever sun and heat is available, which ironically is also exactly the environment that helps the insects multiply in the first place. Try to imagine your own home suddenly without screens on the windows, without any effective insect repellent, without a vacuum cleaner or the modern pest control that keeps most infestations from ever really taking hold. Now imagine that same home shared with several other people, in a building packed with other homes facing the identical problem, all of you essentially living in close proximity to a constant low-level insect population that never fully goes away, just ebbs and flows with the seasons. Horse traffic in the streets outside contributes generously to the fly population too, manure providing ideal breeding grounds that heat only accelerates, and with horses being the primary means of transport and delivery throughout the city, there's really no escaping this particular contribution to your insect troubles. The flies move freely between street and home, between manure pile and dinner table, with an indifference to boundaries that would be almost impressive if it weren't so relentlessly unpleasant. You've developed small defences over the years, out of necessity rather than any particular expertise, covering food with cloth whenever possible, keeping what crumbs and scraps you can away from sleeping areas, airing linens when the weather allows. Though this summer, with heat this persistent, none of your usual defences feel particularly effective. The insects simply outnumber your efforts, breeding faster than you can manage them, thriving in exactly the conditions that are making your own life so difficult. By the end of a long day, swatting, scratching and covering food for the 100th time, there's a particular weary frustration in realizing that even the smallest creatures in your world seem to be having a considerably better summer than you are. They, at least, are thriving in this heat. You're simply enduring it, one swatted fly and one scratched bite at a time, waiting for a change in weather that would, with any luck, thin their numbers along with easing your own considerable discomfort. The children have developed their own strange relationship with the insect population, treating the whole miserable business with the kind of matter-of-fact resilience only children seem to manage, naming particularly persistent flies, competing to see who can catch the most in a cupped hand, turning a genuine household nuisance into something resembling a game. You don't have the heart to fully discourage it, even as you wince at the number of times small hands touch surfaces you'd rather they didn't, because their laughter over something this small is worth more to you right now than a losing battle for stricter hygiene. You've tried, over the years, nearly every remedy whispered about on your street. Sprigs of certain herbs hung near the window, a saucer of vinegar left out to draw flies away from the food, none of which seem to make more than the faintest dent in the actual population. Though you keep trying them anyway, partly out of habit and partly because doing something, even something ineffective, feels marginally better than doing nothing at all. At night, in the dark, you sometimes hear the faint, distinctive whine of a mosquito circling somewhere near your ear, and you swat blindly at the air, missing more often than not before finally giving up and pulling the thin sheet up over as much exposed skin as the heat will actually allow. It's a small, nightly negotiation between comfort and defence, one you rarely win outright, but one you keep fighting anyway, because surrender was never really an option available to you this summer. By morning, the evidence of the night's small battles is usually written across your arms and ankles in fresh red marks, and you catalogue them with the same weary resignation you catalogue most of this summer's ongoing indignities. One more thing to simply live alongside rather than genuinely solve. The children have their own marks too, of course, small scattered bites across bare arms and legs that they scratch at absent-mindedly through the day, and you gently swat their hands away from the worst of it, more out of habit than any real hope of stopping them entirely. By the time they've grown into adults, you suspect, they'll carry the exact same small scars you carry now, an unremarkable inheritance passed down through generations of children who simply grew up sharing their homes with more insects than anyone would ever choose. It's not the inheritance you'd choose for them if you had any real say in the matter, but you've never had much say in most of what gets passed down to your children, and you focus instead on the things you can actually control, keeping them fed, keeping them safe, keeping them, as best you can manage, reasonably comfortable despite everything working against that particular goal, one small, imperfect day at a time. Cholera doesn't care that it's summer, except that it absolutely does, because warm weather is exactly when contaminated water turns from unpleasant to actively lethal, and you're drinking from the same sources as everyone else on your street. Nobody's entirely sure yet exactly how illness spreads through water, not with any real scientific consensus, but everyone on your street has some working theory, passed along through experience and rumour rather than any official medical understanding. What's undeniable, whatever the explanation, is that certain summers bring waves of serious illness through the poorer neighbourhoods, and this summer, with the heat this relentless, feels ominously like it might be one of them. Your water comes from that same shared pump, drawn from sources that sit uncomfortably close to cesspools, drains, and the general accumulated waste of a densely packed city with inadequate sanitation. In cooler months, this is a chronic low-grade problem. In a heatwave, with everything fermenting and multiplying faster in the warmth, it becomes something considerably more dangerous, though you have no way to actually see the danger, no way to test the water beyond trusting your senses, which frequently fail to detect the real threat at all. You've heard, as everyone has, about entire streets falling ill within days of each other, a pattern too consistent to be coincidence, even if nobody's fully worked out the mechanism yet. Some blame bad air rising off the river and the drains. Others whisper about the water itself, and you find yourself, increasingly, inclined to agree with that second group. Watching carefully which pumps seem to correspond with illness on which streets, trading this information with your neighbours like a kind of grim, informal public health network operating entirely outside any official channel. Consider trusting your tap water implicitly, the way you likely do most days, confident that treatment plants and health regulations stand between you and any real danger. Now imagine that same water, drawn from a source you can't fully verify, sitting a short distance from where your neighbours empty their chamber pots, with no treatment process standing between the source and your family's drinking cups beyond your own careful judgment, which, however sharp, has no actual way to detect what's genuinely dangerous. You boil water when you can, for tea if nothing else, some instinct or accumulated folk wisdom suggesting this helps, though you couldn't explain exactly why, and boiling water requires fuel and time you don't always have to spare, especially with the fire already unwelcome in this heat. Still, you do it where you can. A small precaution against a threat you can't see and can't fully understand, hoping it makes a difference even without knowing for certain that it does. When illness does strike your street, it moves fast and hits hard. Sudden, severe sickness that can take someone from apparently healthy to gravely ill within a single day. You watch for the signs in your own family with real dread, any stomach complaint suddenly carrying a weight of genuine fear rather than mere inconvenience, because you've seen, or heard about, exactly how quickly this particular illness can turn fatal, especially in children and the already weakened. Doctors, when you can afford one, offer treatments that range from marginally helpful to entirely useless, because medical understanding of this illness lags well behind its ability to spread and kill. Mostly, you're left relying on rest, whatever clean fluids you can manage, and hope, the same combination of limited resources and stubborn optimism that gets you through most of this summer's challenges. There's a particular, exhausting fear that runs underneath this entire season, a low hum of anxiety about the very water you need simply to survive, unable to distinguish safe from dangerous except through pattern and rumour and luck. You draw your water each morning the way you always have, because you have no real alternative, and you drink it, and you hope, quietly, that today isn't the day your street's luck runs out. Word travels fast on a street like yours when illness strikes somewhere nearby, passed door to door in hushed, urgent tones, everyone eager to know exactly which street, exactly which pump, exactly how close the danger has come to your own doorstep. It's not idle gossip, not really. It's survival information, the closest thing you have to an early warning system in a city that hasn't yet worked out how to protect you properly from something this basic and this deadly. You've started noticing small patterns yourself, which households seem to fall ill together, which don't, filing the observations away without any real scientific framework to hang them on, just the accumulated instinct of someone who has watched this exact danger unfold summer after summer. It's imperfect knowledge, built on coincidence as much as anything provable. But imperfect knowledge is considerably better than none at all, when the alternative is simply hoping blindly. Some nights you lie awake running through the day's water use in your mind, every cup, every pot, every rinse, wondering if you missed some warning sign you should have caught. It's an exhausting kind of vigilance to maintain, this constant low-grade suspicion of something as basic as drinking water, but you maintain it anyway, because the cost of relaxing that vigilance, even once, could be more than you're willing to risk. You've noticed a strange comfort in ritual itself, boiling the tea water the same way each morning, checking the same signs each time, as if the repetition alone might offer some protection beyond whatever actual good it does. Perhaps it does nothing at all, but the ritual cost you little beyond a few extra minutes, and those minutes feel like a fair trade against even a slightly quieter mind. You've taught your eldest the same small rituals too, quietly, without much explanation beyond this is simply how it's done, passing along a habit of caution that you hope, more than you'd ever say aloud, they'll never actually need as urgently as you sometimes have. Still, better they carry the knowledge and never need it than need it and not have it, and so you keep teaching quietly, patiently, the same way it was once quietly and patiently taught to you. It occurs to you sometimes, watching your eldest absorb these lessons with the same solemn seriousness you once brought to learning them yourself, that this is how most of what actually matters gets passed along in a life like yours, not through schooling, which you've had precious little of, but through this steady informal apprenticeship in simply surviving, mother to child, generation to generation, an inheritance that shows up nowhere on paper, but shapes everything all the same. You wonder occasionally what your daughter will eventually teach her own children, whether the specific dangers will have changed by then, whether clean water might someday simply flow from a tap without anyone having to think twice about it. You can't know, of course, but you like imagining it anyway, a small hopeful thread woven through an otherwise thoroughly practical lesson about which pump to trust. If you don't have your own copper, you're hauling your washing to a public washhouse, standing shoulder to shoulder with other women in a room that is, impossibly, even hotter and more humid than the one you left at home. Not every household has its own copper or fireplace suited to boiling laundry, so for many women, wash day means gathering everything up, bundling it as best you can manage, and hauling the whole heavy load to a public wash house, where a fee buys you access to proper facilities, or at least facilities considerably better equipped than trying to make do with a basin at home. The wash house itself is a long room lined with coppers and tubs, dozens of them, each one occupied by a woman doing exactly what you're doing, boiling, scrubbing, wringing all at once, all generating heat and steam simultaneously, in a space that was clearly built for function rather than comfort. On an ordinary day, this room runs warm. In a heat wave, it becomes something closer to a communal furnace, every single copper adding its share of steam and heat to air that already has nowhere to escape to. You find your spot at an available tub, unload your bundle and get to work, and within minutes you're surrounded by steam rising not just from your own washing, but from every single station around you. A thick humid haze that clings to your skin and makes the room feel less like indoor space and more like the inside of a kettle that several dozen women have all decided to climb into together. The noise matches the heat. Dozens of conversations, complaints, and bits of gossip all echoing off hard surfaces, women calling to each other over the sound of scrubbing and wringing, a strange kind of community forming out of shared, sweaty misery. There's a camaraderie to it, admittedly, everyone here understanding exactly what everyone else is going through, trading advice, trading news, commiserating over the particular brutality of doing this exact chore in this exact weather. Imagine a laundromat with no air conditioning, every machine running at full capacity, every dryer venting heat directly into the room instead of outside, and then imagine spending several hours there, doing physical labour the entire time, surrounded by dozens of other people also doing physical labour in that same trapped heat. Your dress is soaked through within the first half hour, sweat and steam combining until you genuinely can't tell which is which anymore. Your hair sticking to your face in damp strands no matter how many times you push it back. The work itself doesn't change just because the room is unbearable. Everything still needs boiling, scrubbing, rinsing and wringing by hand, your arms working the same motions over and over until your muscles ache with a specific familiar exhaustion. You watch the woman beside you pause to wipe her face with her forearm, and you do the same a moment later, an unconscious shared gesture repeated up and down the entire room throughout the day. There's no real relief until you step back outside, and even then the summer air, while technically less oppressive than the wash house, still isn't exactly cool. But compared to what you just left, it feels like a genuine reprieve, and you take a moment, bundle of clean, damp washing balanced against your hip, just to breathe air that isn't quite so thick with other people's steam. By the time you're home again, laundry hung to dry in whatever space allows, you're utterly spent, having traded one hot, humid ordeal at home for an even hotter, more crowded one at the wash house, all in service of the same basic goal. Clean clothes for your family achieved this week as every week through sheer stubborn effort in conditions that seem specifically engineered to make the whole process as miserable as possible. The washhouse attendant, a stern woman who's run the place for longer than anyone can quite remember, keeps a watchful eye over the whole steaming operation, settling disputes over tub priority with a brisk efficiency that brooks no argument. You've learned to stay on her good side, arriving at a reasonably consistent hour each week, tidying your station properly when you're done, small courtesies that make the whole ordeal marginally smoother the next time around. There's a particular economy to the washhouse too, coins changing hands for the privilege of hot water and proper facilities, a cost you weigh carefully each week against simply managing at home with less adequate means. Some weeks the calculation favours the washhouse, when your own fire feels like one burden too many. Other weeks, when coins are especially scarce, you make do at home instead, boiling what you can over your own small hearth and accepting a slightly less thorough result. Walking home afterward, arms aching under the weight of damp linens, you pass the same familiar landmarks you pass every wash day. The corner shop, the church whose bells mark the hour, the particular crooked lamppost that's leaned the same worrying angle for as long as you've lived here. There's a strange comfort in the repetition of it, proof that whatever else this summer throws at you, some things remain reliably, stubbornly the same. Sometimes, on the walk back, you allow yourself a brief detour past a shop window or a quiet church courtyard, just a few extra minutes stolen from the day's schedule, a small private indulgence nobody's tracking but you. It rarely amounts to much, a moment's shade, a glimpse of something pretty, but you've learned to treasure these tiny stolen minutes precisely because they're entirely, uncomplicatedly yours. Then the detour ends, as it always does, and you rejoin the familiar path home, the laundry bundle shifting against your hip, the day's remaining obligations already reasserting themselves in your mind well before you've actually reached the door. Still, that brief handful of stolen minutes stays with you a while longer, a small warm memory tucked away for later, something to return to in thought, if not in fact once the evening's demands take over completely. It's a small trick you've learned this summer, banking these tiny moments of stillness against the busier stretches ahead, drawing on them the way you might draw on a modest savings, a little at a time, whenever the day's demands threaten to outpace your patience. It's not a fortune by any measure, this small hoard of stolen calm, but it's reliably yours, accumulated one quiet minute at a time, and this summer has taught you not to underestimate exactly how far a reliable little hoard like that can actually stretch. If your work requires travel across the city, you're doing it packed onto a horse-drawn omnibus with a dozen other overheated Londoners, all of you sharing the same stale, dust-choked, faintly manure-scented air. If your day requires crossing any real distance, walking isn't always practical, especially in this heat, when arriving already exhausted and drenched in sweat isn't much of an improvement over the alternative. So you join the crowd waiting for the omnibus, a large horse-drawn vehicle that carries passengers along set routes through the city, and you climb aboard already bracing yourself for what's coming. Inside, seating is tight, bodies pressed close together on hard benches, everyone wearing their full layers of respectable clothing regardless of the temperature, because appearing in public in anything less simply isn't done. The windows, where they open at all, let in more dust and noise than actual cooling breeze. The streets outside kicking up a fine grit that settles over everyone and everything inside. The horses themselves contribute their own particular flavour to the journey, both in scent and in the general clatter and jostle of the ride. And in this heat, their labour is just as visible as yours. Sweat-darkened coats, laboured breathing, the poor animals working just as hard to haul a packed vehicle through streets, radiating stored heat back up from the pavement. You feel a certain kinship with them, honestly, both of you simply enduring a workday that the weather has made considerably harder than it needed to be. Packed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, all of you overheated, all of you trying to maintain some semblance of composure and personal space that the cramped seating simply doesn't allow. The ride becomes its own small trial. Someone's elbow finds your ribs, someone else's damp sleeve brushes against yours. Nobody apologises because everyone's too busy managing their own discomfort to spare much attention for anyone else's. Think about your worst experience on public transport during a heatwave, packed train or bus. No working air conditioning, everyone visibly miserable and trying not to make eye contact about it. Now add horses, unpaved or poorly paved streets that jolt every passenger with every rut and pothole, and clothing so heavy and restrictive that simply sitting still generates its own sweat, and you've got a fairly accurate sense of the omnibus experience this particular summer. The ride itself takes time, longer than you'd like, the vehicle's pace limited by the horses and the general congestion of streets clogged with carts, pedestrians and other omnibuses, all competing for the same limited road space. Every extra minute is another minute spent in cramped, stifling proximity to strangers, all of you silently enduring together, occasionally exchanging a resigned glance that communicates more than words could about the shared misery of the journey. By the time you reach your stop and climb down, you're rumpled, damp, and slightly nauseated from the jostling combined with the heat, taking a moment on the pavement just to steady yourself before continuing on foot to wherever you're actually headed. The omnibus got you there faster than walking would have technically, but faster doesn't necessarily mean better, not when the ride itself extracts its own toll in sweat, discomfort, and the particular exhaustion of being pressed against strangers in weather this unforgiving. Still, you'll take it again tomorrow if you need to cross the city, because the alternative, walking the full distance in this heat, in this same heavy clothing, carries its own considerable cost. It's simply a question of which discomfort you're choosing today, and most days, you choose the omnibus, climb aboard, brace yourself, and endure the ride the same way you endure most things this summer, because there's genuinely no better option available to you. You've become something of a connoisseur of which seats offer the least misery, learning through repeated trial which side of the vehicle catches slightly less direct sun at which hour, which spot near the open side offers a marginally better chance at catching whatever breeze the movement generates. It's a small, useless expertise in any other context, but on a packed summer omnibus, it's the difference between a merely uncomfortable ride and a genuinely unbearable one. The conductor, calling out stops in a voice grown hoarse from doing it all day in this heat, moves through the crowded aisle collecting fares with a weary efficiency, occasionally exchanging a brief sympathetic glance with the more visibly wilting passengers, a small unspoken acknowledgement that everyone aboard is enduring the same trial together. There's no real solidarity movement forming over it. Nothing so organised, just a shared, silent understanding among strangers temporarily trapped in the same overheated box. By the time the vehicle reaches its final stop and the last passengers disembark, the whole conveyance seems to exhale along with everyone aboard it, horses included, all of you finally released from a shared ordeal that will tomorrow simply begin again with an entirely new set of overheated strangers taking your place. You've come to recognise a handful of regular faces on your usual route, fellow commuters bound by nothing more than a shared schedule and a shared willingness to endure the same crowded misery day after day. You don't know most of their names. You've simply come to expect their presence, a strange wordless companionship built entirely out of repeated proximity and mutual silent suffering. You'd probably fail to recognise most of them dressed differently, out of context, away from this particular crowded vehicle at this particular hour, and yet within the omnibus itself they feel almost like old acquaintances, bound together by nothing grander than a shared route and a shared willingness to endure it. One or two of them nod a small, tired greeting as you board, and you return it in kind, a wordless acknowledgement exchanged between strangers who, for a few minutes each day, share the exact same small, overheated corner of the world. It's a modest thing, this daily nod, but modest things matter more than they used to, this particular summer having taught you to value small kindnesses far more than you might have thought to before it began. You've noticed the same shift in yourself elsewhere too, a readiness to offer a kind word or a helping hand to strangers you'd have simply walked past without a second thought in gentler weather, as though the shared difficulty of this season has softened something in you that ordinary life rarely gets the chance to reach. Even after the sun goes down, your room holds onto the heat like a grudge, and you lie awake in a house that has been absorbing sunlight all day and has no intention of letting it go before midnight. By the time you've finally finished the day's work, fed everyone, cleaned up what needs cleaning, and settled the children, you're desperate for sleep in a way that goes beyond ordinary tiredness. Your whole body aches with the particular exhaustion of a day spent labouring in heat that never once let up, and all you want is to lie down and lose consciousness for a few blessed hours before it all starts again. Your room, unfortunately, has other plans. Having spent the entire day soaking up sun through that slate roof, through walls that have nowhere to release their stored heat quickly, it holds on to that warmth well into the night, releasing it slowly, stubbornly, long after the sky outside has gone dark. You lie down on your mattress and feel, immediately, that lying still isn't going to provide much relief, the air around you barely different from the air you were sweating through hours earlier. You toss, you turn, you try lying in different positions, hoping one might catch some faint stirring of air, though there's precious little air stirring anywhere in this sealed, overheated room. Your nightclothes stick to you within minutes, and you find yourself, more than once, simply lying still and willing yourself towards sleep through sheer exhausted determination, rather than any actual physical comfort. The rest of your household is in the same state, restless shifting audible from every corner of the room, someone's child fussing quietly, unable to settle either, your husband turning over with a frustrated sigh that echoes your own unspoken frustration exactly. Nobody's getting good sleep tonight, and everybody knows it, and there's a particular kind of shared, silent misery in lying awake together, all equally overheated, all equally aware that tomorrow demands early rising regardless of how poorly tonight goes. Consider your worst night of summer insomnia, tossing and turning, checking the time obsessively, doing math on how many hours of sleep you might still manage if you fall asleep in the next 10 minutes. Now imagine that same restless night, except your room has no fan, no way to circulate even the faintest breeze, no possibility of opening a window to any meaningful effect, and you're doing it after a full day of hard physical labour rather than a day spent mostly sitting in air conditioning. Around midnight, if you're fortunate, the room might finally cool by some small, barely perceptible degree, just enough that you manage to drift into a shallow, unsatisfying sleep, the kind that leaves you nearly as tired on waking as you were before you closed your eyes. More often, you're up again within a few hours anyway, roused by the heat, or by a fussing child, or simply by your own body's inability to settle properly in conditions this uncomfortable. Some nights, when it's truly unbearable, you might venture to sit by whatever window exists, however marginal the relief, just for a change from the mattress and the stifling air pressing in around you. You watch the quiet street below, other windows lit here and there, other women, you suspect, doing exactly the same thing, seeking whatever small relief the night offers, before eventually, reluctantly, returning to bed to try again. By the time the first grey light appears and it's time to rise for another day exactly like the last one, you're already tired in a way that a full night's proper rest would have prevented, carrying forward an accumulated exhaustion that's been building for days now, weeks even. This heatwave showing no particular interest in relenting, and neither, it seems, does the demand that you get up and do it all again anyway. You've noticed, over the accumulating sleepless nights, a kind of low fog settling over your thinking during the day, small mistakes creeping into tasks you'd normally do without a second thought, a forgetfulness that worries you more than you let on. Exhaustion this sustained doesn't just make you tired, it makes you careless, and carelessness in a life balanced as precariously as yours carries its own particular risks. A dropped dish, a scorched pot, a missed step on the stairs. Some nights you've tried sleeping in different configurations entirely, moving your mattress nearer the door, trading places with one of the children in hopes that a different corner of the room might somehow prove marginally cooler. None of it makes much real difference, you've found, though the act of trying at least gives you something to do besides simply lying still and suffering, a small illusion of control over a situation that otherwise offers you none at all. You think sometimes about winter, oddly, on the very worst of these sleepless nights, remembering how desperately you complained about the cold just months ago, how you longed for exactly this kind of warmth, back when your fingers were numb and your breath fogged in your own kitchen. It's a strange, circular kind of longing, wanting the opposite of whatever season currently has its hands around your throat, and you wonder if you'll remember this feeling correctly come January, or if by then you'll have already forgotten just how badly you wanted the heat to end. You suspect, honestly, that you probably will forget, at least partly, the way memory tends to soften the edges of any particular suffering once enough time and distance separate you from it. It seems, somehow, to be the only way people manage to face each new season at all. This quiet, merciful forgetting of exactly how bad the last one truly was. For now, though, you're still squarely inside it, and forgetting is a luxury reserved for some future version of yourself who isn't currently lying awake, damp and exhausted, waiting for a morning that will arrive regardless of whether sleep ever actually comes. You close your eyes anyway, more out of habit than genuine expectation, and let whatever fitful rest is actually available to you claim what it can of the few remaining hours before dawn. Sleep, when it does eventually arrive, comes in shallow, broken pieces rather than any single restorative stretch, and you've stopped expecting anything more thorough from it this time of year. You wake periodically through the night from habit as much as discomfort, checking without quite meaning to that everyone in the room is still breathing steadily, before drifting back under for another brief, unsatisfying interval. By the time proper morning arrives, you're tired in a way that has become almost background noise, a constant low hum of fatigue you've learned to function through rather than around. It isn't good for you, you know that much without needing anyone to tell you. But knowing it and being able to do anything about it are two very different things, and this summer has made that particular gap between knowledge and remedy achingly clear. Doctors of the era have a grim little nickname for this time of year, because infant deaths spike every summer from contaminated milk and water, and if you have small children, you know this, and you are afraid of it, quietly, all season long. Every mother on your street understands, in the way you understand a fact of life you'd rather not think about too directly, that the hottest weeks of summer bring a predictable, dreaded rise in serious illness among young children. It has a name, a clinical, almost dismissive-sounding name, but there's nothing dismissive about watching your own child weaken from it, And you know families who've lost little ones to exactly this in summers past. The cause seems tangled up with everything else this heat makes worse. Spoiled milk, contaminated water, food that turns before it should, all converging on the most vulnerable members of your household with cruel efficiency. Your children play in the same warm streets, drink from the same uncertain water sources, eat whatever food you can manage to keep safe in a season, determined to spoil everything faster than you can use it. And you watch them, all summer, with a vigilance that never fully relaxes. When a child does fall ill, and this summer it seems like nearly every family on your street has faced it at least once already, the progression can be frighteningly fast. A normal, playing child by morning reduced to something pale and listless by evening, and you find yourself doing everything you know how to do. Small sips of whatever clean fluid you can manage, cool cloths, quiet reassurance, while an undercurrent of genuine fear runs beneath every calm word you offer. Think about the last time your own child had a stomach bug, and how even with a pharmacy down the street, a doctor a phone call away, and clean water readily available, you still worried. Now strip away the pharmacy, strip away easy access to a doctor who actually knows what's causing this, strip away any reliable source of clean water to even offer as a substitute for whatever made them sick in the first place, and sit with that fear for the several days it typically takes for a child either to recover or not. You've learned, through hard experience and the shared wisdom of other mothers, some small things that seem to help, though none of it is guaranteed, none of it backed by any real medical certainty. Weak, well-boiled barley water sometimes settles a troubled stomach. Keeping a sick child cool and quiet, out of direct sun, seems to matter. Beyond that, you're largely relying on the body's own resilience, and praying that resilience proves strong enough this time. If things worsen, and sometimes they do despite everything you try, a doctor's visit costs money you may not have to spare, and even then, medical understanding of exactly what's happening and how to treat it effectively remains limited. You might be offered remedies that do little beyond making everyone feel like something is being actively done, a small comfort in itself when helplessness is the alternative, but not necessarily the actual solution the situation demands. Other children in the household need care too, of course. Life doesn't pause around one sick child, and you find yourself stretched even thinner than usual, tending the sick one while still managing meals, washing, and whatever work you can't afford to fully set aside, all while carrying the low, constant hum of worry that doesn't lift until your child is clearly, unmistakably on the mend. When recovery does come, and thankfully it does more often than not, the relief is profound, a held breath finally released. But the fear doesn't fully leave you, not for the rest of the season, because you know this particular danger will return with the next hot spell, and every summer from here forward will carry this same quiet dread, tucked beneath the ordinary business of raising children in a city and a climate that offers your family so little protection. You've started marking the calendar in your head by illness rather than by month, this being the week 2 doors down lost their youngest, this being roughly when the worst of it struck last year too, a grim private almanac built entirely from accumulated fear, rather than anything so pleasant as the weather or the season's usual markers. It's not a habit you'd choose exactly, but it's proven useful more than once, letting you brace yourself a little earlier than you might otherwise for the weeks doctors quietly agree are the most dangerous. Other mothers have their own private rituals too, you've noticed. Small superstitions and precautions that may or may not do anything at all, a particular herb kept near the door, a specific prayer said each night, actions that offer, if nothing else, the psychological relief of feeling like you're doing something rather than simply waiting helplessly for danger to arrive or pass. You've adopted a few of these yourself, not because you're entirely convinced of their power, but because the alternative, feeling entirely powerless, is somehow worse than the small effort of trying. When you do finally reach the far edge of this dangerous season, when the nights start cooling again and the particular illness that stalks these months begins, mercifully, to recede, there's a collective exhale that moves through the whole street, mothers greeting each other with a little more warmth, a little more relief in their voices, all of you having survived together. One more of these long, frightening summers. You mark the occasion, quietly, in whatever small way feels right, perhaps a slightly better meal if you can manage it, Perhaps just a longer moment spent watching your children play, healthy and unbothered, in the cooling evening air. It's not a celebration anyone else would recognize as one, but you know what it means, and that's enough. You carry that small private relief with you into the following days too, a slightly lighter step, a slightly easier laugh, evidence of a burden temporarily lifted even as you know, full well the season isn't finished with you quite yet. You let yourself enjoy it without guilt, this brief lightness, because a season this demanding offers precious few genuine reasons to feel good, and you've learned not to waste the rare ones by second-guessing whether you've earned them. The remedies you reach for during the worst of it are a peculiar patchwork of things half-remembered from your own mother, and things simply invented on the spot out of desperation. A spoonful of this, a weak tea of that, none of it backed by anything you'd call actual medical certainty, but all of it offered with the fierce, unshakable conviction that doing something is better than doing nothing, while you wait for the doctor, if you can even afford one, to make his rounds. The doctor, when he does come, tends to confirm what you already suspected, that this is simply the season doing what the season does, and that the real treatment is time, clean water if you can manage it, and the same patient watching you've already been doing since the fever started. It's not the answer you wanted exactly, but it's honest, and honesty, this time of year, counts for quite a lot. You've noticed you sleep differently during these weeks, lighter, more alert, waking at the smallest change in a child's breathing the way you never used to before you had children at all. It's an exhausting kind of vigilance, sustained across weeks rather than hours, and you wonder sometimes whether you'll ever fully unlearn it once the danger has actually passed, or whether some part of you will simply keep listening for trouble long after there's any real reason to. On top of the actual physical misery, there's the social misery. A lady, or even a poor woman with any pretensions to respectability, is not supposed to visibly sweat, flush, or show any sign that the weather is affecting her at all. As if the actual physical experience of this heat weren't enough on its own, there's an entire additional layer of misery layered on top of it, the expectation that you endure all of it while appearing calm, composed, and entirely unbothered, because visible discomfort reads as a lack of refinement, and refinement, however unaffordable it actually is for someone in your position, remains something you're still expected to project. A flushed face, damp underarms, hair coming loose from its pins in the heat, all of these are treated less as understandable responses to genuinely brutal weather and more as small personal failings, evidence that you haven't quite managed to hold yourself together the way a properly composed woman should. You catch a neighbour's sideways glance at your damp collar and feel, absurdly, a flicker of embarrassment about a bodily function you have precisely zero control over. You find yourself, throughout the day, employing small tricks to minimize how visibly affected you appear, dabbing your face discreetly, rather than openly wiping the sweat away, angling yourself so that any dark, damp patches on your dress are less noticeable, keeping your composure in your voice and expression even while your body is, quite literally, cooking beneath 4 layers of fabric. It's exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with physical labour and everything to do with the sheer effort of performing calm you don't remotely feel. Consider trying to look effortlessly put together on the hottest, most physically demanding day of your year. No makeup touch-ups, no quick trip to a cool bathroom to freshen up, just constant, unbroken performance of composure regardless of how thoroughly your actual physical state contradicts it. Any slip, any visible sign of struggle, risks comment, judgment, the kind of quiet social cost that matters enormously when your standing in your community and your household's reputation both depend on being seen as capable and composed. Men, notably, get somewhat more latitude here. A working man visibly sweating through his shirt in the heat is simply a man doing hard labour in hot weather, unremarkable, expected even. A woman in the same condition risks being read differently, as somehow less controlled, less proper, less able to manage herself with the dignity expected of her sex. An entirely unfair double standard that you didn't create and can't do much about, beyond simply enduring it, alongside everything else this season demands. There's also the matter of your complexion, sun and heat, both working against the pale, unblemished look that's held up as the standard of feminine beauty in circles you'll likely never fully belong to, but whose standards still somehow shape how you're perceived. Flushed cheeks, freckling skin, a general weathered look from labouring outdoors or over hot fires, all of it marks you visibly as someone who works hard in difficult conditions, which is simply true, but which carries its own quiet social weight you'd rather not carry on top of everything else. You manage it the way you manage most things this summer, with a kind of practiced, weary resilience, holding your expression steady even as sweat trickles down your spine, keeping your voice pleasant and even in conversation, even while every part of your body is screaming for relief you have no access to. It's a performance nobody particularly acknowledges or thanks you for, just another invisible tax on top of the very visible physical demands the heat is already placing on you. By the end of the day, when you're finally alone, even if only briefly, there's a certain relief in simply letting your shoulders drop, letting your face show exactly how exhausted and overheated you actually are, without an audience to perform composure for. It's a small, private mercy, one of the few genuinely free things available to you this summer, and you take it gladly, even knowing tomorrow will demand the same careful performance all over again. You've noticed the toll this particular performance takes on women around you too, a tightness around the eyes, a permanent slight furrow that comes from constantly monitoring your own expression for any sign of slippage. It's exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with physical labour, a kind of emotional labour layered on top of everything else this season demands, and you rarely see it acknowledged by anyone, least of all the people whose opinions you're performing so carefully for in the first place. Among yourselves, though, the women on your street, there's an unspoken permission to drop the act entirely. A doorway conversation where everyone admits freely to feeling wretched, faces flushed, collars damp, without a hint of the careful composure required everywhere else. These small pockets of honesty matter more than they probably should, brief windows where you're allowed to simply be as hot and miserable as you actually are without cost. You wonder sometimes, watching a particularly composed lady pass by, untouched by any visible discomfort despite the same brutal sun beating down on her too, whether she's simply better sheltered from the worst of it, or whether she's performing exactly the same exhausting calm you are, just with better resources to make the performance easier to maintain. You suspect, honestly, it's probably a bit of both. Either way, you've stopped measuring your own worth against her composure or against anyone else's, deciding somewhere along the way that surviving this heat with your family, fed and your work done counts as its own kind of success, regardless of how flushed or dishevelled you happen to look while accomplishing it. It's a quiet kind of confidence, hard-won and rarely spoken aloud, but it steadies you all the same, a small internal ballast against a season that seems determined to judge you for things entirely outside your control. You've built that ballast slowly, over years rather than weeks, and you suspect you'll go on needing it for years still to come. One more piece of quiet, hard-won equipment carried alongside the bucket and the flat iron, and everything else this life has required you to gather along the way. There's an entire silent language of composure you've learned, without ever being formally taught it. Exactly how to dab at your face without appearing to dab, exactly how to arrange your shawl to hide the worst of the damp patches, exactly which posture reads as merely warm rather than visibly suffering. Nobody sat you down and explained any of this. You absorbed it the way you absorbed most things, by watching your mother do the same quiet performance before you, and her mother before that, an inheritance of composure passed down as reliably as any recipe. The truly wealthy, you've noticed, don't even have to bother with this particular performance, since they're rarely out in the heat long enough for anyone to catch them looking anything less than composed, ferried from shaded doorway to waiting carriage in the brief handful of minutes where the sun might otherwise get a good look at them. It's a kind of protection money can buy that has nothing to do with willpower or grace, and everything to do with simply never having to stand in the sun long enough for it to matter. You've made peace with the unfairness of that particular arrangement the same way you've made peace with most of this summer's unfairnesses, by setting it down rather than carrying it, because there's no version of carrying it that changes anything except how tired you feel by the end of the day. Better, you've decided, to save that energy for the work actually in front of you. Ironing requires heating flat irons on a stove, which means standing directly beside a heat source for hours, pressing clothes for people whose lives do not involve standing beside a heat source for hours. If ironing is part of your work, whether for your own family or as paid labour taking in other people's washing, This stage of the process might be the single most miserable task of an already miserable season. The irons themselves are heavy, solid pieces of metal that need to be heated directly on a stove or over a fire before they're of any use, and you keep several going at once, rotating them as each cools, which means the fire beside you never really gets to die down for the entire duration of the work. You stand close, necessarily close, because the iron loses its heat quickly once removed from the stove and you need to work fast before it cools past usefulness, pressing it firmly across fabric while radiant heat from both the iron itself and the fire behind you combine into something that feels less like a household chore and more like an ordeal specifically engineered to test your endurance. Sweat runs freely down your face as you work, your arm aching from the repetitive motion, pressing and lifting, garment after garment, each one needing careful, even pressure to come out properly smooth. A moment's distraction risks scorching the fabric, ruining someone's shirt or, worse, someone's payment for having ruined it, so you can't even allow yourself the relief of a distracted, half-hearted effort. Full attention, full effort, directly beside an open flame for hours. If you're taking in ironing as paid work, which many women do to supplement whatever else brings income into the household, you're doing this not just for your own family's clothes, but for stacks belonging to other people entirely, people who will never see, and likely never think about, the conditions under which their crisp, neatly pressed shirts and dresses were actually produced. They'll simply receive clean, pressed clothing and think nothing further of it. Imagine standing directly beside your stove, oven door propped open, for several consecutive hours, handling hot metal tools with only a folded cloth for protection, in a room already struggling with heat from every other direction. Now imagine doing it as one part of a longer workday that includes several other equally demanding, equally hot tasks, and you'll understand why ironing day carries its own particular dread among the many demands this season places on you. The irons themselves present real physical danger too, not just discomfort. A moment's carelessness, exhaustion catching up with you after hours of repetitive heat exposure, and you could easily burn yourself, a real and constant risk that becomes more likely the longer and hotter your shift runs. You've certainly nursed your share of small burns across your fingers and wrists over the years, each one simply absorbed as an unremarkable cost of the trade, rather than anything worth much complaint. By the time the stack of ironing is finally complete, folded neatly, ready for collection or returned to your own family's wardrobe, you're utterly drained. Your face still flushed from proximity to the fire, your dress soaked through at the back and beneath your arms. There's a certain satisfaction in the neat, crisp results laid out before you, proof of skilled, careful work completed despite genuinely brutal conditions, even if nobody who ultimately wears those pressed clothes will ever fully appreciate exactly what it cost you, in sweat and heat and effort, to get them looking quite that sharp. You've developed calluses over the years in exactly the spots where the iron's handle presses hardest. A small map of your trade written directly onto your own palm, invisible to anyone but you and perhaps another laundress who'd recognise the exact same marks on her own hands. There's a strange pride buried somewhere in those calluses, proof of genuine skill built up over years of careful, repetitive labour that most people simply take entirely for granted. The coins you earn from this particular work go towards something specific each week, sometimes shoes for a growing child, sometimes a bit extra set aside against the inevitable lean weeks of winter, and you find yourself thinking about that destination while you work, letting the purpose of the labour carry you through the worst of the heat radiating off the stove. It doesn't make the work cooler exactly, but it makes it bearable in a way that simple obligation alone wouldn't quite manage. By the time you've delivered the finished stack to whichever household or neighbour commissioned it, received your payment, and made your way home again, the sun has usually dipped low enough to offer at least the illusion of relief, and you allow yourself a moment walking the familiar streets to simply exist without a hot iron in your hand for the first time since early that morning. Your shoulders ache in a specific familiar way by evening, a soreness you've come to associate so thoroughly with this trade that its absence, on the rare day you don't iron, feels almost strange, as though something's missing that shouldn't be. It's a small, unglamorous kind of expertise, but it's genuinely yours, earned one scorching hour at a time. You rub a little liniment into the worst of the ache before bed, a small nightly kindness to a body that's given you nothing but hard, uncomplaining service through yet another punishing day. It's a small enough gesture, this bit of liniment and a moment's care, but you've learned this summer that small gestures are sometimes the only ones you have the resources left to offer, even to yourself. It's enough most nights, this small allotment of self-care, and you've stopped expecting more from yourself than that, having learned the hard way that demanding more only leaves you with less to give everyone else who depends on you. You fall asleep most nights before the ache has fully eased, trusting your body to keep working on it quietly through the night the way it always does, patching itself back together just enough to face tomorrow's identical demands. The other laundresses have their own small tricks for surviving a day beside the stove, a particular way of standing that keeps you slightly further from the worst of the heat, a rag kept wet and draped over the back of the neck between garments, tricks passed along casually between the two of you the way other trades might share tips about tools or technique. You've picked up a handful yourself over the years and offer them freely to whoever's new enough to still be learning the job the hard way. There's a strange, grim camaraderie in it, all of you standing shoulder to shoulder over identical hot irons in an already unbearably hot room, nobody complaining much because everybody's enduring exactly the same thing, and complaining rarely makes an iron any cooler. Instead you talk, when you have breath to spare for it, about anything except the heat, which somehow makes the heat marginally easier to bear. By the day's end, your hands know the work so thoroughly they barely need your attention anymore, testing an iron's heat with a practiced flick, gauging a fabric's resistance without really thinking about it. Muscle memory built from years of exactly this same punishing routine, repeated through summer after summer, just like this one. If your work keeps you outdoors, the sun will mark you for it. Tanning and freckling skin in a society that reads a suntan as a class label, proof you labour outside rather than lounge indoors. Whether you're selling goods on a street corner, doing washing outdoors, running errands across the city, or simply walking to and from work under a relentless summer sun, your skin doesn't get much choice in the matter. Hours of direct exposure, day after day, week after week, leave their marks, browning and freckling skin that was, at the season's start, considerably paler, and there's no parasol in your budget to prevent it, no wide-brimmed leisure hat, no option to simply stay indoors during the worst of the midday sun. You notice it first in small ways. A tightness across your nose and cheekbones after a particularly long day outside, skin that feels hot to the touch, well after you've come in from the sun. Within days, that tightness gives way to peeling in places, uncomfortable and itchy, and beneath it a deepening colour that won't fade again until well into autumn, if it fades entirely at all before next summer starts the whole cycle over again. Here's the trouble, and it's a trouble that has nothing to do with your actual comfort and everything to do with how you're perceived. Pale, untouched skin is read, in the circles that set fashion and social standards, as a mark of leisure, proof that a woman has never needed to labour outdoors, that she can afford to stay shaded, indoors, protected. A tan, by direct contrast, marks you instantly as working class, someone whose skin has been marked by necessity rather than choice. Think about how casually you might apply sunscreen today, protecting your skin without a second thought, tanning or not tanning treated as a purely personal preference, with no particular social weight attached either way. Now imagine that same sun exposure carrying a genuine social cost, visibly marking you as belonging to a lower social tier regardless of your actual circumstances or character, simply because your work happens to require you to be outside while wealthier women's work, or lack thereof, does not. You might try small remedies where you can manage them, keeping to shade when your work allows even a moment of it, wearing whatever hat or bonnet you own pulled low against the worst of the direct sun, though most of these offer only marginal protection against hours of cumulative exposure. Some women swear by various homemade concoctions meant to lighten freckles or soothe sunburned skin, lemon juice, buttermilk, various folk remedies passed down through generations, though their actual effectiveness varies considerably, and none of them undo what the sun's already done by the time you're applying them. There's a particular unfairness to it that you're well aware of, even if you rarely voice it directly. The very labour that keeps your family fed and housed is the same labour that marks your body in ways society then judges you for, a double bind you didn't create and have essentially no way to escape. You can't stop working outdoors, and you can't stop the sun from marking you for it, so you carry both, your labour and its visible evidence, without much choice in the matter. By the end of the season, your arms and face carry a deep settled colour that will linger well past the heat itself, a visible record of an entire summer spent labouring beneath a sun that showed no particular mercy. It's not vanity that makes this sting, not really. It's the knowledge that this mark, earned through genuine hard work, will be read by some as a flaw rather than a fact, one more small indignity layered onto a season that's already asked so very much of you. Your own daughter, still young enough to be mostly unbothered by any of it, has inherited the same tendency to freckle quickly in strong sun, small marks already scattered across her nose after just a handful of warm days, and you catch yourself, more than once, wondering what kind of a life is waiting for her, whether she'll spend her own summers labouring outdoors the way you have, carrying the same visible marks and the same unfair judgments that come with them. There's a particular resilience you've built around this over the years, a way of holding your head steady even when you catch someone's eyes, lingering a beat too long on your weathered complexion, a refusal to let a stranger's fleeting judgment cost you any real portion of your own self-regard. It took time to build that resilience. It didn't come naturally, and some days it still wavers more than you'd like it to, but mostly now, it holds. You think sometimes about the women who came before you on this same street, in this same trade, wearing this same sun-marked skin, and about the women who'll come after, and there's something almost steadying in that long unbroken line, proof that this particular mark of labour has never once been anything to be genuinely ashamed of, whatever passing judgments it happens to attract. Come autumn, the colour will fade a little, softening back towards something closer to your winter complexion, and you'll almost miss it when it goes. This visible record of a summer survived, replaced eventually by whatever new marks the following season decides to leave on you instead. For now, though, summer isn't finished, not by a long stretch, and you turn your attention back to the sun still climbing outside, and the day's work still waiting, entirely unmoved by any of your reflections on freckles or fairness. You square your shoulders, pull your bonnet a little lower against the glare and step back out into it, because the sun, like everything else this summer, isn't going to wait for you to feel ready before it demands your attention again. You've stopped waiting for readiness a long time ago, honestly, having learned that this particular summer simply doesn't grant that courtesy to anyone, least of all to women like you who have work waiting regardless of how the weather happens to be treating them. Readiness, you've come to think, is something of a luxury reserved for people with the freedom to postpone their obligations until conditions improve, a freedom that has never once been part of your own arrangement with the world, and you've long since stopped resenting its absence quite as sharply as you once did. Instead, you've simply learned to begin regardless, whether or not the day feels manageable, whether or not your body feels rested, because beginning anyway, day after day, is ultimately the only thing that has ever actually gotten you through a summer like this one, and it will, you're fairly sure, be exactly what carries you through whatever remains of it too. Your children are hot, cranky and hungry, and you have limited water, limited food and limited patience, and somehow you're expected to conjure comfort for them out of practically nothing. By this point in the day, you've already fetched water, boiled laundry, cooked over an open flame, and endured whatever your particular labour demanded of you, and still, waiting at home, are children who are just as hot and miserable as you are, with none of the adult capacity to simply push through it quietly. They're cranky, restless, too warm to settle into any game or activity for long, and they look to you, as children do, expecting you to somehow fix a problem that's genuinely beyond your control. You do what you can with what little you have. A damp cloth pressed to the back of a small overheated neck. A few precious sips of water, carefully rationed because there's no telling when you'll manage another trip to the pump, and every trip costs time and effort you're already desperately short on. You find whatever shade exists nearby and encourage them toward it. Though shade in a densely packed street offers only modest relief from heat, radiating off every surface around them. Feeding them presents its own challenges layered right on top of the heat itself. Appetites shrink in weather like this, children pushing away food that under normal circumstances they'd eat readily, and you're left trying to coax at least something into them, aware that they need the nourishment even if their overheated little bodies aren't particularly interested in cooperating, and whatever you do manage to get them to eat needs to be something that hasn't already spoiled in the heat, narrowing your options considerably from what they might already be. Consider trying to entertain and comfort restless, overheated children with no access to a cool indoor space, no popsicles from a freezer, no swimming pool or sprinkler to run through, nothing beyond your own limited resources and whatever patience you can muster after your own exhausting day. You'd likely find your temper fraying faster than usual, and you notice the same thing happening to you now, snapping more quickly than you'd like. At complaints you understand completely, but have no real power to fix. There's guilt in this too, a quiet undercurrent beneath the exhaustion, watching your children suffer through heat you can't shield them from, wanting desperately to make it better, and having so few actual tools available to do so. You tell yourself, and it's true, that every mother on your street is managing this exact same struggle, that you're not failing them so much as facing circumstances that would challenge anyone. But the guilt lingers anyway, the particular guilt of a parent who wants to fix everything and simply can't fix this. You improvise where you can, letting them play with water when you have any to spare, even just a shallow basin that becomes, for a few precious minutes, a source of genuine delight rather than another chore. Small mercies, stretched as far as they'll go, becoming the currency you trade in to get everyone through another impossibly hot day, and toward, hopefully, a slightly more bearable night. By the time you finally get them settled, tired enough despite the heat to actually sleep, you sit for a moment in whatever quiet remains, replaying the day's small failures and small victories, the moments you managed to bring some relief and the moments you simply couldn't. Tomorrow will bring the exact same challenges, the exact same limited resources stretched against the exact same relentless heat, and you'll face it again, the way you face everything this summer demands of you, with whatever patience and resourcefulness you can manage to scrape together one more time. Your eldest, old enough now to help a little, has started taking on small tasks without being asked. Fetching a cloth, minding a younger sibling for a few minutes, small acts of assistance that ease your burden more than they probably realize. You feel a complicated mixture of gratitude and guilt watching it happen, glad for the help and simultaneously sorry that a child this young has already learned to read exhaustion on their mother's face clearly enough to want to fix it. The games the children invent to pass the hottest hours have a particular ingenuity born of having almost nothing to work with. A length of string becomes an entire afternoon's entertainment. A puddle left by spilled washing water becomes a miniature ocean for imaginary ships made of scraps of bark. You watch them sometimes, marveling quietly at how thoroughly children can transform deprivation into invention, a skill you suspect will serve them well for whatever the rest of their lives happen to demand of them. When the last child finally drifts off, breathing slow and even despite the lingering warmth, you allow yourself a long look at each small sleeping face, cataloguing, the way you do most nights, exactly how they've grown, exactly what worries and delights the day contained. It's the closest thing to a quiet victory lap you get, this brief inventory of your children safe and fed and finally blessedly asleep. One more day successfully carried across the finish line. Tomorrow will ask exactly the same of you, and the day after that too. But tonight at least, the ledger balances. Children fed, children safe, one more impossibly hot day successfully absorbed and set down, and that, on nights like this, is honestly all the victory you need. You bank what's left of the fire, check the latch on the door out of long habit, and take one last look around the small, crowded, overheated room that holds everything and everyone you're responsible for, before finally letting yourself rest too. Whatever tomorrow brings, and you have a fairly reliable sense of what it will bring, it will find you rested at least this much, however imperfectly, and that small margin of recovery is, some nights, the very thing that gets you through the following day intact. Some nights, when the heat refuses to break even after dark, you resort to more inventive measures, wetting a sheet and draping it over the window frame in the hope that whatever faint breeze exists might cool itself, passing through the damp fabric before reaching your children. It rarely works as well as you'd like, but rarely is not the same as never, and on the nights it does work, even slightly, you count it as a genuine victory. You've also learned which of your neighbours keep a slightly cooler room, thanks to some quirk of the building nobody can quite explain, and on the very worst nights you're not above asking whether the children might sleep there instead. A favour traded back and forth across the whole floor so consistently that by August nobody even remembers who originally owes whom. Motherhood in a heatwave, you've discovered, runs largely on this kind of quiet, reciprocal debt. Feeding a family through a heatwave on a labourer's wages requires its own particular arithmetic, stretching whatever coins you have toward food that won't spoil before it's eaten, which in this weather narrows your options to nearly nothing appetising. You've become, out of sheer necessity, something of an expert in which foods survive a single scorching afternoon, and which don't, knowledge no cookbook would ever think to include, but that every mother on your street has acquired the same hard way. The heat has a way of making even ordinary parenting decisions feel weightier than they should. A normal case of crankiness reading, for one anxious moment, like the beginning of something worse, because you've heard enough stories this summer of children who seemed merely tired one evening and were gravely ill by morning. You check foreheads more often than you probably need to, reassure yourself more times than strictly necessary, and try not to let the worry show on your face, because your children read your face closely enough as it is. By the time you've talked yourself down from the evening's fourth or fifth minor panic, you've usually also managed to get everyone fed, cooled as much as circumstances allow, and settled, which strikes you, on reflection, as a genuinely impressive feat of multitasking that absolutely nobody is going to acknowledge or applaud, least of all you. When the work is finally done, you get a small, precious window of stillness, sitting in the last of the day's heat before it all begins again tomorrow, exactly the same, in exactly this weather. There's a particular hour, once the children are finally settled, once the fire's been banked for the night, once every last task of an exhaustingly long day has been checked off, when you get to simply sit, and this hour, however brief, is arguably the most valuable thing you own this entire summer. Nobody's asking anything of you in this hour. Nothing needs boiling, hauling, ironing, or minding. You're simply, briefly, allowed to exist without demand. You settle wherever you can, maybe near whatever window offers the faintest hint of evening air, maybe just on the edge of your own bed, and you let your shoulders drop in a way they haven't been able to all day. The heat hasn't actually broken, not really. The room still holds most of the day's warmth, but the frantic pace of the day has finally stopped. And that alone feels like relief, even without any actual drop in temperature. You might mend something small in this hour, a torn hem, a loose button, quiet work that requires just enough attention to occupy your hands without demanding much from an already thoroughly depleted mind. Or you might do nothing at all, simply sit, and there's something almost luxurious about that nothing, a rare permission to stop moving that the rest of your day never grants you. From your window, if you're positioned to catch it, you might hear the street settling too, voices quieting, carts finally stilled for the night. The particular hush that falls over a working neighbourhood once the day's business is concluded. Somewhere nearby, another woman is probably doing exactly what you're doing, snatching this same small window of peace before her own household demands sleep, and tomorrow demands everything all over again. Think about the relief of finally sitting down after an exceptionally long, hard day. That first moment your body actually gets to stop. Muscles you didn't realise were tensed finally allowed to unclench. Multiply that relief by an entire summer of days this demanding, and you start to understand why this particular hour matters so much. Disproportionate to how objectively comfortable it actually is. It's not comfort you're finding here, not really. It's simply cessation. And after a day like today, cessation is its own kind of gift. You think, in this quiet hour about tomorrow, the water that needs fetching, the washing that needs doing, whatever labour tomorrow specifically demands of you, and there's a certain weary acceptance in it rather than dread exactly. You've survived today, you survived yesterday, and the day before that, and every scorching day this heatwave has thrown at you so far, and there's a stubborn, quiet confidence in that track record, even as you're honestly not sure how many more days like this you have the energy left to survive. Eventually, even this small stillness gives way to sleep, or at least the attempt at it, your body finally too exhausted to stay upright regardless of how uncomfortable the room remains. You lie down, one more time, in the same overheated space you've been enduring all summer, and you close your eyes, and you let the day end quietly, the way it always ends, with nothing resolved about the weather itself, only the simple, hard-won fact that you made it through one more of these relentless days, and that this summer is very nearly everything. Somewhere in the last drowsy minutes before sleep finally claims you, your mind drifts, unbidden, towards small fragments of the day. The particular colour of the light at the pump this morning, a joke a neighbour made that you're still faintly smiling about, the specific relief of setting down a full water bucket after the long walk home. These fragments arrive in no particular order and serve no particular purpose beyond simply being the last things your tired mind chooses to hold on to before letting go of the day entirely. You think, briefly, about the women in your own family who came before you, your mother, her mother before that, all of them presumably lying down at the end of equally punishing summer days in rooms not unlike this one, carrying the exact same accumulated exhaustion you're carrying now. There's something almost companionable in that thought. A long, unbroken line of women who simply kept going, kept enduring, kept somehow finding a sliver of peace at the very end of each impossible day, and you find yourself, however briefly, counted proudly among them. The building around you settles into its own nighttime rhythm, floorboards easing as they cool by whatever small degree they manage to, the faint murmur of a neighbour's voice fading into silence, the whole structure exhaling the way it does every single night regardless of what the day demanded of everyone living inside it. You let that rhythm carry you the rest of the way, past thought, past worry, into whatever shallow, overheated sleep the night is willing to offer, trusting as you always do that morning will arrive again exactly on schedule, ready or not. And it will. It always does. The sun that has made this entire season such a trial rises again tomorrow with the same complete indifference it's shown every morning before this one, utterly unbothered by whatever it's asked of you today, utterly unconcerned with whatever it will ask of you tomorrow. You will rise to meet it anyway, the way you always have, because that, in the end, is simply what surviving a summer like this one requires. There's a particular quality to this kind of tiredness, worth noting, that's different from the collapse into bed exhaustion of a single terrible day. This is cumulative. Weeks of heat stacked one on top of the other, each day's fatigue never quite fully resolved before the next day's begins, so that by this point in the summer you're operating on a kind of permanent, low-grade depletion that's become simply your normal state rather than anything requiring comment. And yet, somehow, this hour of stillness manages to feel genuinely restorative anyway, disproportionately so given how little has actually changed about your circumstances. The room is still hot. The work will still be waiting tomorrow, identical in every particular. But something about sitting still, however briefly, resets whatever internal reserve keeps you upright. Enough that you can imagine, however faintly, doing all of it again tomorrow without it breaking you entirely. You think sometimes, in this quiet hour, about whether anyone will ever know what a summer like this actually demanded. The 1,000 small negotiations with heat and exhaustion, and impossibly limited resources that never make it into any history anyone writes down. Probably not, you conclude, and there's a strange peace in that too, a kind of freedom in doing something difficult that nobody will ever specifically credit you for, because you were never doing it for credit in the first place. And if nothing else stays with you from tonight, let this much stay. Comfort is not owed to anyone in any century, and the fact that you have it now so easily, so completely, without fetching a single bucket or lighting a single fire, is worth noticing every single night. Not just this one. Sleep now, properly, gratefully, in whatever cool, quiet room you happen to have. She would have liked that for you. She would have liked that for herself too. So that was a single hot stretch of summer, seen through the eyes of a poor Victorian woman. Water hauled by hand, laundry boiled over open flame, a wardrobe of wool buttoned to the throat, and a river that smelled like the end of days, all endured without a single fan, a single ice cube, or a single day off to recover. And still, somehow she got up the next morning and did it again. There's something almost stubborn about that, isn't there? Not stubborn in a small way, but in the deep, unglamorous way that doesn't get statues or storybooks. She wasn't fighting battles or ruling empires. She was fetching water, minding sick children, ironing other people's shirts beside a fire she didn't want lit, and somehow finding at the very end of it a quiet half hour to just sit and breathe. That's its own kind of heroism, even if history never quite thought to call it that. So tonight, as you lie there in a room that actually cools down, under a fan you can switch on with one lazy finger, on sheets that came out of a machine instead of a boiling copper pot, maybe spare a small thought for her. For every woman who sweated through a heatwave in 4 layers of wool, who nursed a baby through spoiled milk and prayed, who hauled a bucket down the street before breakfast and did it again before dinner. History was rarely kind to her, and comfort even less so. But she endured, season after relentless season, and in her own quiet, exhausted way she made it through. So breathe easy tonight. Let the fan hum. Let the water run cold from the tap without a second thought. You've earned this rest, same as she earned hers, all those long sweltering summers ago. Wherever you are tonight, whatever your own version of a long day looked like, let it go now. Let your shoulders drop the way hers finally did. The heat will still be there tomorrow if it needs to be. Tonight it can wait. Sleep well. And to every one of you listening from wherever you happen to be tonight, thank you for spending these few hours with a poor Victorian woman and her endless sweltering summer. If you made it all the way to the end, wide awake or otherwise, you're exactly the kind of listener this channel was built for. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next one.